Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I am Jimena Acedo, Senior Economist in the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF, and it's my privilege to host the 10-year Anniversary Conference of TADAT. Before we proceed, I'd like to address a few housekeeping issues. For our online audience, I kindly ask that English speakers remain in the current channel. Pour les francophones, pour écouter la conférence en français, s'il vous plaît, sélectionnez la chaîne française dans le symbole du monde en bas à gauche de votre écran. Y para los hispanohablantes, para escuchar la conferencia en español, seleccione el canal español en el símbolo del mundo situado en la parte inferior de la izquierda de su pantalla. Thank you for your cooperation. And now let's move forward with our exciting agenda for today's conference. Without further ado, I would like to call on the stage Catherine Bayer, Deputy Director in the Fiscal Affairs Department, for her introductory remarks. Please join me in welcoming Catherine to the stage.
Thank you very much, Jimena. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon. Hello, everybody. And I'd like to welcome you to the 10-year anniversary conference of TADAT, the Tax Administration Diagnostic Assessment Tool. This gathering marks a milestone in our efforts to design a framework for assessing tax administration systems that is standard, widely applicable, and internationally recognized. Today's event will allow us to take stock of TADAT's impact and together, partners, experts, and stakeholders define some next steps to ensure the tool continues to be relevant in the rapidly evolving environment in which tax administrations around the world operate. Let me provide a bit of context for understanding the role of TADAT. My colleagues at the Fiscal Affairs Department have estimated that additional spending in low-income developing countries, averaging nearly 16% of gross domestic product per year, would be required to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Further, Vitor Gaspar and others have found that in countries that exceed a tipping point of about 15% of GDP in tax revenue, real GDP per capita increases sharply and in a sustained manner over the following decade. But there are still too many countries that have not reached this threshold. To finance government spending, domestic revenue mobilization, or DRM as we know it, continues to be front and center of the international policy discussion. A sound tax policy framework and well-functioning tax administration play a critical role in raising such resources. And here is where TADAT comes in. The launch of TADAT in 2014 made it possible to assess the performance of tax administrations in a standard, objective, and systematic manner across countries. Prior to this, there was no real harmonized assessment tool to evaluate the relative strengths and weaknesses of a country's tax administration system relative to good practices. International organizations and governments conducted various diagnostic assessments, but there was no uniform framework that allowed this assessment to be conducted in a consistent and systematic manner across countries and over time. Because of this, the introduction of TADAT has been nothing short of revolutionary in the field of tax administration, especially as it relates to emerging market and developing countries. The results of a TADAT assessment provide tax administrations, ministries of finance, capacity development providers, and others with a baseline to assess the outcome of the tax administration system. Based on this assessment, policymakers can design and implement reforms to address the main areas of relative weakness. They can also undergo repeat assessments that enable country authorities, capacity development providers, and others to measure progress over time as a result of modernization programs. We will have the opportunity to discuss this more during the first session, which will focus on 10 years of TADAT implementation. I am pleased to note that the TADAT Secretariat has produced a very nice report that delves into this and other issues and that will serve as a basis for our discussions. And there is no doubt regarding the reach of TADAT. Since the initial pilot assessment that took place about 10 years ago, TADAT teams have conducted 180 assessments in 107 countries, meaning that more than half of the IMF's member countries have undergone a TADAT. A unique aspect of TADAT is that it's been designed and implemented as a collaborative tool. A broad group of stakeholders helped design the tool, and teams representing various organizations carry out the TADAT assessments in countries. So, TADAT has represented effective interinstitutional collaboration since its inception and continues to do so. It has been innovative, with the TADAT podcasts bringing together analysts and practitioners of tax and customs administration to discuss the current challenges and new applied research. Because of its reach, TADAT now boasts a solid database that can be used to understand the main trends in tax administration effectiveness and to conduct applied research. During this conference, we will take stock of the tool's achievements and reflect together on its future in an ever-changing tax environment in which tax administrations are facing new challenges. The second session will focus on how to safeguard the tool's relevance, ensuring it remains widely applicable and recognized. In the run-up to this conference, the TADAT Secretariat organized a series of regional workshops with tax authorities and regional tax organizations that have resulted in a number of very useful contributions. Your reflections and suggestions during this conference will build on those discussions and will be instrumental in the process of revising the TADAT Field Guide, which is expected to be launched in the first quarter of 2025. All of this has been possible thanks to the generous and continuous support from our partners, the European Union and the governments of France, Germany, Japan, the Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, and the UK. Thank you very much. Let me end by saying that I greatly look forward to a lively exchange of views and to continuing our collective effort to ensure that the TADAT remains a cornerstone of tax administration modernization globally. With that, let me turn the floor back to our Master of Ceremonies, Jimena. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for your remarks. Let's proceed with our event to take stock of TADAT's impact over 10 years. We will start with a presentation of the paper titled 10 Years of Assessing Tax Administration Globally, Developments, Achievements, and Remaining Challenges. This paper provides valuable insights into the performance of tax administration systems in over 100 countries. It will be presented by Modeste Mopa, head of the TADAT Secretariat. After the presentation, we are gearing up for an engaging panel discussion that promises to dive deep into the use and impact of TADAT across the world, moderated by Ruth Demoyi, Deputy Director in the Fiscal Affairs Department. I would like to now call on our stage to our esteemed moderator, Ruth Demoyi, and our distinguished panelists for the first panel of the day. Please take a seat and make yourself comfortable. Join me in extending a warm welcome to Ruth and our esteemed panelists as they make their way to a stage. And now I warmly welcome to the stage Modeste Mopa, head of the TADAT Secretariat, to lead us through the presentation. Modeste, you have the undivided attention of an eager audience. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jimena, for your kind introduction. I will try to sum up in 20 minutes 10 years of TADAT contribution to the enhancement of tax administration worldwide. So about 10 years ago, an ambitious project named TADAT for Tax Administration Diagnostic Assessment Tool was launched by the IMF, the World Bank, and a group of partners Catherine mentioned in her opening remarks. The project was ambitious in its substance and its approach. It was ambitious in its substance because it intended to offer to the tax community a tool to assess in a standardized way the health of tax administrations across the world. But it was also ambitious in its approach because it was meant to be designed and implemented collaboratively. 10 years later, we can start looking at the results of this endeavor. To assess this endeavor, we will look at TADAT activities in the last 10 years, share the major trends as they appear from the assessments, and draw the main lessons that were learned from this experience. If we could sum up the key activities around the TADAT tool in 3 words, they would be assessments, trainings, and outreach. How do they look like in figures after a decade of implementation of the tool? In 10 years, TADAT has been deployed in 107 countries of all continents and at all income levels. In terms of number of assessments, 180 TADAT assessments were conducted, of which 135 nationals and 45 at subnational level. From a regional perspective, Sub-Saharan Africa has had the highest number of assessments with 55 national assessments. From the income classification perspective, emerging middle income countries have had 70 assessments, while 59 assessments were conducted in low income countries. In terms of assessment team configuration, 94% of the assessments were conducted by at least 2 agencies. The most common configuration being teams of 3 to 4 agencies, respectively 35 and 20%. In line with its objective to facilitate a shared view of tax administration reform baselines and priorities by all stakeholders, we can affirm that TADAT assessments have been a joint effort. In terms of training and outreach, 159 TADAT trainings, both at regional and country levels, were organized during the last 10 years. 4,000 people were trained and passed the exams. 626 were qualified TADAT assessors. Other outreach activities included 264 podcasts in various languages, 43 live casts, and TADAT coffee chats. These trainings and outreach facilitated a better understanding of the TADAT methodology and explained why TADAT was widely accepted, not only as a diagnostic, but also as an evaluation tool to measure whether the reforms efforts were bearing fruits. So, are the reform efforts bearing fruits? TADAT as an evaluation tool shows us a major trend in tax administrations. As a matter of fact, the data collected from TADAT repeat assessments during the last decade allows to make a general statement that tax administration have been improving. A sample of 23 countries that have had a repeat assessment was used in the TADAT report Jimena mentioned to compare the status of a tax administration system over time. As a reminder, repeat assessments usually happen anywhere from 4 to 8 years from the initial assessment. On average, overall scores move from 2 to 2.3 or from a C to a C+. Repeat TADAT assessments show progress, highlighting the impact of assessments, reform efforts, and capacity development delivered to country to improve domestic revenue mobilization. The progress is across all income levels and regions. Of all the countries analyzed, 2 low-income developing countries made the most significant progress. From a regional perspective, on the left, progress in sub-Saharan Africa has been somewhat greater. Sub-Saharan Africa realized an overall improvement on average of 0.33 points from 1.84 to 2.18, while Europe saw an improvement on average of 0.22 from 2.45 to 2.66. So what could be the possible explanation of sub-Saharan African progressing the most? Is it that the improvement plans based on TADAT assessment results are more impactful as they focus on identified areas of greatest need? Is it because African countries have benefited significantly from capacity development initiatives in tax administration? Or is it that the initial disparity may explain the relatively greater progress observed in African tax administration over time, as many tax administrations in the African region likely started their development journey from a lower baseline of institutional effectiveness compared to those of Europe? Possibly the answer is a combination of all this. An analysis by area shows that the progress has also been made in all areas of tax administration, but the degree of progress varies. It has been strongest in supporting voluntary compliance and revenue management, and weaker in payments, and especially on tax arrears and debt stock. So if the main trend is that tax administrations have made progress across the world, among the lessons learned is that whereas the fundamentals are in place in most tax administrations, there is still a lot of room for improvement. As a reminder, the TADAT methodology scores the various aspects of tax administration on a 4-scale rating ranging from D to A. A for a score that meet international good practices, B for sound practices, C for fundamentals are in place, and D for fundamentals of a good tax administration are not in place. On the right, the scatter plot shows an overall score for each of the TADAT assessments. And on average, tax administration systems perform at a basic level, which is 2 or a C, that is fundamentals of tax administration are in place. A handful of tax administration perform a solid level, a sound performance, which is a B level or above. Based on this, we can say that the basics of tax administration systems are in place, but there's still room for improvement. In fact, while from a general point of view, the fundamentals are in place, most areas show room for improvement. With risk management and accurate reporting appearing as the areas with more room for improvement, while promoting voluntary compliance shows the best performance. Aggregated data clearly identify areas of good practice and areas where tax authorities are still facing challenges as they appear. However, there are nuances based on more granular data. You can see the areas where tax administration are doing good, like supporting voluntary compliance, payment, dispute resolution, revenue collection. But there are nuances. While dispute resolution and revenue management generally appear to be areas of good practice, specific aspects of these areas, such as the timely handling of disputes and the timely VAT refunds, continue to pose difficulties for most tax administrations. One area for improvement worth highlighting is that of transparency. And even if this is not one of TADAT's scoring criteria, the very low rate of publication of the performance assessment reports after TADAT assessment, which is 27 out of the 135 assessment conducted at national level, this very low rate of PAR publication is an indication that there's still room for improvement as far as transparency is concerned within tax administrations. The data also show that the performance of the tax administration system increases with income level. We see significant differences between and within income levels. Good practices are more pronounced in the tax administration of advanced economies than those of low-income countries, although countries with good scores were still identified in the latter. Emerging economies are in the middle, with some tax administrations performing at a solid level. Let's talk about fragile and conflict-affected states. The data show that they lag in almost all areas compared to the rest. The largest gaps being on taxpayer registration, support for voluntary compliance, e-filing, and accountability and transparency. These results might give an indication to officials and CD providers on area where more work is needed for these countries. To conclude, what could be the key takeaways from the 10 years of TADAT implementation? I would like to share 5 of them with you. Number 1, TADAT is a valuable tool for analyzing the performance and progress of tax administrations along with the traditional and often exclusive focus on revenue collection. Number 2, TADAT data combined with other databases can contribute to research to improve understanding of tax administration and strengthen the capacities of this key institution, the tax administration. Number 3, by clearly identifying the weaknesses in tax administration, TADAT helps support tax authorities to focus their limited resources on relevant areas, CD providers to improve the impact and coordination of their interventions. Number 4, through training and other activities, TADAT is a powerful tool to establish a common understanding of tax administration fundamentals and promote peer-to-peer learning. And number 5, the tax administration landscape is constantly evolving, so TADAT must adapt. So for more details on the results of 10 years use of the TADAT tool, please consult the decennial report produced by the TADAT Secretariat under Catherine supervision, which is available on the TADAT website, a copy of which is also provided in this room. Many thanks to the entire TADAT team, the Revenue Administration Division's colleagues, and of course, the TADAT partners. Thank you once more.
Thank you, Modeste, for that excellent presentation. It provides us with a very comprehensive overview of the achievements and the challenges faced by tax administrations globally. Now, I would like to hand over to Ruud, who will moderate the upcoming panel discussion. Ruud, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jimena, and thank you very much, Modeste, for this very nice introduction. Congratulations to you and the Secretariat on this achievement, 10 years of TADAT, and welcome everyone here to this panel discussion and the sessions about this. I think what strikes me is that TADAT is so much more than a diagnostic framework. TADAT has really created a community where people have a common understanding and a platform for discussion on what is good practice. So it goes well beyond sort of this tool. And as you showed, 4,000 people have finished and took the exam on the training. So there's 4,000 people who have this common understanding. What you also showed is that this is a source of information that can be used for research, so we can better understand what are the implications of sort of good practice. And what I also like is sort of you've also created this community through the podcast and through coffee talks, and this is what people can sort of see and watch and exchange on what are the good practices. So. All very nice, and also from your presentation it became very clear that TADAT, by doing these assessments, is not just the assessment, but each assessment contributes to the database that provides the benchmark. And this benchmark is really a public good for everyone, because every country can compare himself to this benchmark. So it's creating a public good that is to the benefit of us all. And I think that you showed very nicely. And but also, last thing before we go, is what I like is the repeat TADATs, where you can really see what is the developments over time. Really interesting to see that there's already 28 of them. So with that, we're going to have a panel discussion. So we have until 10 past half 4, so it's a bit more than an hour. And we're going to discuss both with the providers of capacity development, we're going to discuss with the recipients, with the donors. So we're going to have an exchange, and also with academic, to discuss the 10 years of experience of TADAT, and based on the presentation that you've just seen. So I'm going to introduce the panelists, but you may think there are 4 panelists, and that's true, 4 panelists on the stage, but actually we have 6. There's 2 mystery guests that you will see in a minute, and I'm going to introduce them to you now. But let me start with one that is on the stage, which is Andrea Lemgruber, who's sitting on my very right. Andrea is the division chief of the Revenue Administration 2 division, and that division is in charge of capacity development in Africa and the Western Hemisphere. Then to my direct right is Commissioner General Dingani Banda from the Zambia Revenue Authority. And Mr. Banda has been a leading advocate of modernization and digital transformation projects in the Tax and Customs Administration of Zambia. So glad you are here. Thank you for coming. Then let's move to, well, they're no longer mystery guests, but they are on the screen, so we can see you. Roxana Rua, you can see on the right on the screen. Roxana is the head of the fiscal policies sector at the European Commission's Directorate General for International Partnerships. And she is leading a team of experts dedicated to supporting EU partner countries in domestic revenue mobilization and public financial management. Also on the screen is another colleague from the European Commission. That's Gabriela Chirkova, the deputy head of the Unit for Revenue Administration and Public Financial Management. And she's in DG Reform, the Directorate General for Structural Reform. So welcome both. We'll get back to you in a second. Then I go to my left, and that's Mary Bain. Mary is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Africa Tax Administration Forum, ATAF. And ATAF serves as an African network that aims at improving tax systems in Africa through exchange, knowledge dissemination, capacity development, and active contributions to regional and global tax agendas. And ATAF also joins many of the TADAT assessments. Then to my very right is Dr. James Alm. Welcome. James is the Professor Emeritus of Economics at Tulane University. And he has done extensive research on the behavioral responses of tax. For instance, in areas of tax compliance, but also the merits penalty or the merits bonus in the tax system, opportunity zones, housing choices, economic growth, corruption, interesting work on voluntary disclosure schemes and tax amnesties. And he has also worked on fiscal decentralization reforms in many developing countries. So that's our panel. So we're now going to have 2 rounds of questions for the panelists, and after that there's an opportunity for you to raise questions to the panelists. So you can already start thinking of what you would like to ask them, and we'll get back to that for the last 20 minutes of this discussion. So Andrea, we're going to start with you. So what, in your view, are some of the most important results of TADAT for tax administrations in developing countries? And to what extent have the results of the TADAT assessments been used in guiding CD?
Okay, so thanks, Ruud, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by saying if I can think about 2 main results, the impacts of TADAT overall, I would say first, helping us understand in a very integrated, clear way and structured, I think like we mentioned, structured way, like what good practices are for tax administrations. And Catherine, you used the word revolutionary, and I think it is. Like really like TADAT has been a pioneer in saying, okay guys, let's get together, let's discuss the practice, and let's have a kind of language of common understanding. It seems easy, but it's not, right? Because think about before TADAT. Like we could go to a conference or a meeting, we could say, oh yeah, I heard like that country, that region is doing well on this, but you know, there was nothing structured. And so we do have now the field guide, and it is amazing because everybody refers to the field guide as a point of reference. It's written, it's there. So I was thinking, okay guys, like let me ask you, how many businesses do you know that have a field guide like we do have, like with practices, right? And saying, okay, like you can go and check what the frontier of our businesses is. And not many, probably. And this is the importance of TADAT for revenue administrations, tax administrations, and this applies to everybody, from low-income countries to advanced economies. The second one is really trying to show that tax administrations operate in an end-to-end cycle. And I call this tax administration A to Z. And why is this important? Because it's not enough to say, oh, I'm good in one area, and then I fail in other areas. Why? Because tax administration is an integrated cycle. So I see many times when we go in CD, administrations that invest in auditing, for example. And then they do a good job, they have lots of tax assessments, taxpayers dispute that, and guess what? They all get stuck in dispute resolution systems that don't work. So in the end, we were not effective in improving tax compliance, in mobilizing revenues. So TADAT is very visual on this with the will. Like you needed to be good at everything, and I think we showed, Modeste, you showed that it's still very imbalanced. So in terms of our practice route, CD, I would say we use TADAT as our baseline, especially because more and more, and we are here celebrating also the GPFP, like our medium-term view and projects, like more and more we engage in medium-term reform programs, and we need to have a clear baseline. And a baseline that is a common understanding with the authorities, and of course, understanding weaknesses and strengths. So we saw POA2, risk management, not being so good. And then we work a lot in terms of compliance risk management. So it's a way that we link things together. I think we measured, measuring also, gauging this progress. It's very important for us. Many practitioners here and partners, we know it's not easy for us to say, what impact do you generate on the ground? And with the repeat TADATs, as we saw, we can see, because we are applying the same structured methodology 5-8 years later, and now we can see, okay, do we move the needle or not in terms of our programs? So that's very important too. And final things from me, I think like you just mentioned, the analytical side of it. So after 10 years, the database is just amazing. We could see how many dots in that scatter plot. And if we join this with our ISORA, our International Survey on Revenue Administration, RA-GAP, and other tools that we have, we are just sitting on an amazing and rich database that now it's linking analytical power back to CD. And so I I'm seeing like our CD is becoming more data-driven, and of course, we are providing much more efficient and effective CD to our membership.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrea. So TADAT, revolutionary, and also the fact that it's a comprehensive framework, the tax administration system, and that you cannot sort of let one thing go, and very important messages. Thank you so much. So, Commissioner General, you're a recipient of, so to say, the TADAT assessment. What have been the impact of the assessment and also the training in Zambia? And perhaps you can also say something about countries in which you've been interacting.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll start by congratulating TADAT for the 10th anniversary. Zambia Revenue Authority, we have been part of the history of TADAT in the sense that in 2013, we were one of the countries that was involved in the pilot on TADAT. And 2 to 3 years later, in 2016, we went through our first performance assessment reports, and then the follow-up was in 2022. And the importance of TADAT cannot be, overemphasized. It's a critical game changer. It's very important for tax administrations to have a reference point, an international benchmark that you can use to measure how you are performing, your strengths and weaknesses. As Zambia Revenue Authority, we took advantage of that and embedded it into our planning processes as an institution. So to start with, in our assessments, one of the fundamental issues we did, particularly on the issue raised on training, is that we ensure that a number of our members of staff are trained on the TADAT framework. So overall, we've about 80 members of staff that have been trained on the TADAT framework, both the physical and the online version. And using that now, it gave us a basis now to ensure that even as we participate in the performance assessments, we are highly expectant in terms of what are the key performance outcome areas that are being measured and what is the criteria behind that particular score. So using that, we ensured that our members of staff were actively involved in the 2 TADAT assessments that were carried out over the period. And the most important part also is the after assessment, what do you do with the results? So for us, we again use the members of staff to develop a remedial action plan, which fed into our corporate strategic plan. Looking at now, what are the issues that were identified as our strengths, particularly most important, the weaknesses. How do we make sure we address the weaknesses in our subsequent strategic plan? And our strategic plan also forms a basis for engagement with cooperating partners to identify where are the weaknesses, which are the areas that need to be identified. So training, very key. Internal capacity building, very key, but most important, feeding into the corporate strategic plan. And with our Zambia, we've made sure that we incorporate the key results area. I'll give an example. One of the findings in our 2022 assessment was that our domestic taxes was not integrated. We had direct taxes and indirect taxes operating separately. And working with the USAID, Revenue for Growth, we've now operated a new model where we've created a single large taxpayer office. And that has been achieved within the course of this year in Q1. We also had a weakness in the sense that our VAT performance has been quite bad in terms of on-time filing, aspects to do with the compliance generally, and also timely payment of refunds, which Modesta raised here. And we've embarked on a more ambitious program to address VAT, starting with migrating to electronic invoicing system, where we've benchmarked with Rwanda, and we're now in the process of implementing an electronic invoicing system, which we've called Smart Invoice. We're also working with IMF on a VAT control program, where we're actively trying to address aspects, including compliance risk management, which have not been existent in our environment. We are also working on the issue of using of third-party data as a basis for us to cross-check how valid the declarations that are being made. Again, in that space, we are working with the GIZ to build our data warehouse, which is called BIDA in Zambia. And using that also, we're creating interfaces with other third-party institutions. Another weakness that was identified is that we had not carried out a tax gap study. And with USAID and UNU wider, we're now carrying out various tax gap studies, which are forming a basis now for us to know the various gaps. So it has formed a basis for us, like I indicated, to identify the weaknesses, fit into our strategic plan, but most important, also benchmark with other countries within the region. We've worked closely with Rwanda. In fact, our mutual administrative agreement was benchmarked on TADAT. What is Rwanda good at? What are we good at? What are we weak at? And then we compare and say, what assistance are we going to get from each other? And that formed the basis now for us to work on the model for the electronic invoice, which we are implementing. And also looking at the support we're getting from the IMF. The key issue is that we've been partnered with Peru and Paraguay. Our team went there to see what is it that they've done better in terms of VAT control. So you can see that at local level, at also international, regional level, international level, TADAT is helping us now develop that framework that we can use as an international basis for us to make progress in addressing the various weaknesses. So that's what I can say in a nutshell for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing this. Really interesting and inspiring to hear that how you have sort of learned from countries in the region like Rwanda, but also teaming up now with countries from Latin America to sort of learn from their experience. Very interesting. So we're going to raise a question online to Roxana. Roxana, you are one of the donors, and so maybe from your experience, you can share with us how TADAT has helped mobilize support for tax administration reforms in beneficiary countries.
Thank you very much, Ruud. Good afternoon, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, although virtually. Thanks, Ruud, for your question. I think there are many ways in which TADAT has helped mobilize external support for tax administration reforms. I will highlight three of them. First, TADAT assessments have been instrumental to identify the most pressing areas for reform in a given country by giving a precise overview of the strengths and weaknesses in its systems. And in this way, it also helps partners identify, together with the authorities, the specific areas in which their support is likely to make the greatest impact. Second, I think a strong asset of TADAT is its evidence-based approach. TADAT assessments follow a solid methodology which makes them comparable across countries and regions, but also across different periods of time through the repeat assessments. So TADAT can be used to monitor reform progress over time, which allows partners to assess the effectiveness of their support and to adjust it as needed. Third, TADAT assessments provide a good basis for coordination among different partners. I think this has been mentioned already. It gives them a common foundation on which to base their capacity development activities, and in that way, it fosters consistency and complementarity in the support provided by partners. Let me give you one example. One of the most recent assessments that the European Union financed via the RMTF took place in Malawi. It was a repeat assessment finalized last year. So following the performance assessment report, the Malawi Revenue Authority requested support to develop a medium-term reform strategy addressing the weaknesses identified in the TADAT report. As a result, a post-TADAT reform plan was designed to identify a number of key reform actions and to establish a timeline for their implementation. Both the TADAT assessment and the post-TADAT report informed the design of several programs by Malawi's partners. These include the IMF's Extended Credit Facility, the World Bank's Fiscal Governance Program for Results, the Economic Governance Program co-funded by the EU and GIZ, and the upcoming EU budget support operation in the PFM sector in Malawi, which will include two important indicators on the share of large taxpayers filing their VAT returns online and on making the Revenue Appeals Tribunal operational. So this is just one example of a case in which a TADAT assessment was the basis of a reform action plan, which then was supported by partners in a coordinated manner. So to conclude, TADAT is an important instrument in the EU toolbox to support tax administration reforms and domestic revenue mobilization. As you know, the EU is a long-standing partner of TADAT with a €4 million contribution to the Secretariat and several assessments financed so far, both in the EU and outside. And that's why this is really important to us, that the TADAT Secretariat continues to be provided with the human and financial resources it needs to conduct its activities independently. So we will follow with interest how the new setup will work with the integration of TADAT within the GPFP, including on governance and budgetary aspects. And we hope that the independence of the TADAT Secretariat will be preserved in this new setup, as it's the most efficient way to ensure that TADAT continues to be seen as a powerful, robust, and objective tool. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roxana, for sharing this, and also thanks for all the support that you've been providing. And indeed, the idea is to maintain the Secretariat as it is. Very interesting also to hear from you about sort of the structure, the diagnostic, and then the follow-up on that with the strategic plan, as we also just heard from the Commissioner General. So interesting examples. So Mary, let's move to you. You're one of the partners providing TADAT assessments. So from ATAF's perspective, how do you assess the collaboration among the CD providers in the use of the TADAT framework, and what are the main lessons that you have learned?
Thank you so much, Ruud. I'll also start by congratulating TADAT on your 10th anniversary, and I thank you for your kind invitation to ATAF. As one of the partners, I totally agree with your initial remarks where you said that we have become a community, because the work that TADAT has been doing has been extremely useful in all our work. And I really base my response on largely the work that has been happening in Africa, because that's the work where ATAF has been involved. And I think we started the partnership in 2017, and since then we have participated in 24 TADAT assessments on the continent, and these assessments have been really, really an eye-opener for our work. And the key areas of collaboration where I would like to really focus on are three. The first being that TADAT, by its nature and by its structure, has been very fundamental in helping us to have a firm basis of the capacity building work that we carry out in countries. So previously, maybe to give a bit of perspective, the work that we do largely is to build capacity on the continent and provide technical assistance. And because of this, a lot of our work is demand-driven. But TADAT has enabled us also to provide supply-driven support, because once these assessments are made, then it's easy to see where there are gaps and address those gaps. So the first area, therefore, of collaboration has been a firm basis for capacity building work. And wherever there's a TADAT assessment carried out, we can hit the road running because we know the areas that need support. So that's one part. The second is something that maybe we don't focus on a lot, but it is the interaction between the different partners. Because of that interaction, we have noticed that it has reduced a lot of duplication in the work that we do. Because we have these discussions and because we are able to provide our different inputs, it helps everybody to grow and to understand the needs better of the recipient country. And this has been really, really invaluable. The third area has been the communication. Because of the work that we do in these assessments, we are able to determine the weakest points, and we are able to help those countries and communicate as a team on how we can best support this. So where I think maybe there can be some improvements, the first one is maybe I listened to Modest well. He did say that at least 620 people have been trained as assessors. I think there's a need for continuous professional development of the assessors so that people don't just rest in their laurels, because as he concluded, there's so many things changing. And because of that change, it is important for us to continuously try and build that capacity. The second area is maybe we should think of setting key performance indicators and say, yes, there's been an assessment, but after this assessment, then what? Should maybe some of the assessors then be able to help this country? Because just like you request initial information and then follow through during the assessment, post-assign the assessment, how are we able to follow through and see that these are actually being implemented? And if they're not being implemented, who can go in to support them? Because we're now working in this as a partnership. I think, and then lastly, again, this is very similar. It's really the coordination between the different assessments and monitoring and evaluating how these are actually happening and encouraging people to have repeat assessments, because if you looked carefully at what Modeste said, these are actually helping countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for sharing this. And interesting to hear how you see TADAT also helping the development partners coordinate among the same sort of priorities identified in the assessment. So we already heard a few times about the importance of TADAT producing information and producing data that can be used for other purposes, including research. So my question to you, James, is how useful has TADAT data been for research purposes and the knowledge of tax administration systems?
And now for something completely different, an academic perspective here. Thank you, Ruud and Catherine and Modest and Huang and Jacqueline as well. Let me focus on the two issues that Ruud has addressed to me. How useful has TADAT been for research purposes, and what more can we do with it? I doubt if I'll say anything that most of you don't already know, but here goes anyway, and you get what you pay for. So here are three ways in which I think TADAT has been especially useful in research, some of which have already been emphasized here. First, policy advice on tax administration, and as we know, tax administration is tax policy, must be based on hard evidence rather than speculations or impressions or anecdotes. And TADAT data provide this hard evidence based on an identical methodology applied to all countries in the same way. And these data are now starting to be used in quality empirical work, as demonstrated by various research papers that I've seen and have been provided to me. Especially a very nice recent paper by Hassan Adan and his colleagues quantifying the revenue yields from tax administration reforms. I wish I'd written the paper. Second, the initial focus of TADAT was on central government tax administration. And indeed, I sat here at the IMF, not in this particular nice room, 6 years ago, almost on exactly the same date, looking at the progress over 4 years. And at that time, there was virtually no analysis of subnational tax administrations. That's changed a lot. Of the 180 assessments on the TADAT website, 45 now are subnational governments, and I think that's especially useful and a nice contribution. Third, as has been emphasized here, tax administrations have a range of responsibilities. Most obviously, they enforce the tax laws, but they also provide services. And there's growing evidence that the ways in which taxpayers respond to enforcement and services is affected by the trust that taxpayers have in government and government tax administration. The entire TADAT framework, I think, nicely incorporates all three of these functions. What in other work with colleagues, I've termed three paradigms for tax administration: an enforcement paradigm, a service paradigm, and a trust paradigm, and which also overlaps with World Bank work on tax reform and tax administration. I think having the IMF with a major initiative that emphasizes all three of these paradigms is tremendously useful in sending a message to tax administrations around the country that they are not simply enforcing laws, they are also providing services and trying to build trust. However, what more can be done? And in particular, what more can be done to enhance research? Well, as was mentioned, the TADAT database is meant to be a public good. And for a public good to be most effective, it needs to be non-exclusive. By my count, only 47 of the 180 assessments in the TADAT website are publicly published. If you really want to get outside researchers involved in research, they need to have access to this. And the IRS Joint Statistical Research Program may be a model for what might be done. Second, and more fundamentally, as I read the various TADAT documents, the emphasis that I take away from that, and which has to some extent been corrected by the nice discussion up here already, is almost entirely on what the various grades or scores are. And that's obviously entirely appropriate for tax administrations, and people here have shown the positive aspects of these data. However, from a research perspective, I believe that this could lead to an undue focus only on the scores in and of themselves. Surely we don't really care about the scores themselves, in and of themselves. What we really care about, at least what I really care about as an economist, is what these scores tell us about what I will call the true outputs that we want any tax administration to deliver. Specifically, does an improvement in a particular dimension score, or a particular indicator score, or a particular performance outcome area score lead to an improvement in these true outputs? And what are these true outputs? They're things like tax revenues, tax effort, compliance rates, tax gaps, compliance costs, equitable distribution of tax burdens, a range of things that everybody here knows far more about than I do. Or even broader aspects like trust in government. In short, how do TADAT scores link to these true outputs? And so I would argue that to be most useful, at least for researchers, TADAT needs to be better able to link its administrative scores with these development outcomes. And I think that's starting to happen. Again, refer back to the Hassan Adan paper. I've just heard that Catherine and colleagues are working on the ways in which these relate to tax gaps. But I think more emphasis on those links, especially with outside researchers, like moi, would be quite useful. In any event, I applaud TADAT for the great progress that's already been made. I believe it is a tremendous contribution to improving tax administrations around the world.
Thank you so much, James. Really interesting and important to emphasize, first of all, the fact that publication of reports is important to reveal all the information, also the underlying information. And then that, of course, we ultimately want to understand how the TADAT scores translate into outcomes, because this, first of all, teaches us about how sort of the validity of the TADAT scores themselves, but also it can teach us something about what should be in TADAT. What are the new areas, for instance, that we should pay attention to from research, and how that can be linked to TADAT itself. So thanks a lot. So this was the first round of questions. We can now go to the second round. And so the first round was pretty general about the value of TADAT. The second round is more going into some of the results that we have seen. And I'm starting with you, Andrea. So one of the issues that came from the report and from the presentation by Modest is an area where most tax administrations are struggling to make progress, which is tax debt management. Maybe you can elaborate a bit on what are the reasons for this, and what are the implications and lessons for you as a CD provider?
Yeah, thanks, Ruud. And well, that's an interesting finding of the TADAT, assessment. And once again, the importance to know data, no? Because that's a good example that having data available, we can really dig down and try to now shape our CD to improve, for example, tax arrears. So in this case for TADAT, we are talking about arrears becoming older. Actually, what it means in this indicator is that arrears over 12 months now have a larger share of proportion in relation to the overall arrears. And why is this bad? Because, of course, if arrears are older, they become more difficult to collect. So at one point, we can even say that it's uncollectible data, arrears, and then it's becoming like a big problem for tax administration, including on the perception of compliance, right? Like that's going on in a country. And mentioning again, like how can we use data to be more analytical? We also took a look at the ISORA database. Many thanks to Liz that it's here with us to see, okay, what ISORA is telling us. What is the difference between TADAT and ISORA? ISORA, I will have more countries. It's a larger database. It's self-reported. Then it's not like it's different from TADAT in this sense, but I have annual data as well. So, and it's very similar. We see from ISORA also that arrears are not improving. Actually, we don't see a trend coming down. So that's the question, like what is happening? We had a discussion last week with my colleagues in my division, some possible causes for that. I would say starting from the pandemic. Of course, a huge external shock on tax administrations. And we know that many tax administrations put in place some measures to alleviate the financial burden on taxpayers. Let's say just one could be like installment plans with a longer profile. And of course, like maybe, you know, it became more difficult to follow up after that. And in our CD, we have been observing that the capacity to enforce collection has not been restored after the pandemic. So at one hand, what I'm saying is that, well, we provided more leeway to taxpayers. We needed to do that at that moment. But on the other hand, after some years now, we are not like fully back in terms of enforcement powers. So that's one lesson, right? Then some colleagues mentioned SOEs, state-owned enterprises. Why? Because in many developing countries, SOEs are responsible for a large share of arrears, tax arrears. There is a very important political economy aspect there, we all know. And SOEs also have been impacted by the pandemic. We know they were used as policy instrument to alleviate issues like, okay, we needed to continue like providing energy, water, for example, even if citizens could not pay. This deteriorated the financial positions of SOEs, tax debts, and here we are, you know, with the difficulty of recovering this debt. So pandemic as a big general topic. Other structural issues, I guess I will refer to my point, the integration of all functions. We are seeing administrations focusing a lot on registration. Let's increase the tax net, very good. Informal economy, let's put more taxpayers in the tax net, and filing with all the digital trends, e-filing, very good results, but they forget about collection, no, the collection powers. So again, a bottleneck in the cycle that may generate arrears. Like people were saying, collection powers, enforcement collection is not a so sexy function in the tax administration. So in some sense, we don't invest there, and then we have accumulation of arrears. And probably the last one that I would mention is that in some countries, the functions are fragmented. And this is a good reminder of TADAT also being not only a tool to measure the tax administration health, but the tax administration system health, right? So there are other sometimes stakeholders that are involved, that are outside the tax administration, that are very important for the results as a whole. And in many countries, like the collection function is not integrated in the tax administration. It's a model, it's okay, but because of the agencies don't talk to each other, and after the pandemic, we can see also something like happening there in terms of this conversation, a deterioration in the following up of the arrears. So possible, more detailed causes for why this is happening.
Thank you, Andrea, for sharing. And it was good that you mentioned also ISORA, which is a complementary database that also provides information about the time series, which is really important. This is a collaboration with other institutions. OECD is involved, CIAT, IOTA, but important source for research also. So, CG Banda, a question to you is related to another challenge for most tax administration, which comes clearly out of TADAT, which has to do with the integrity of the registered taxpayer base and the effective risk management. So how do you and other authorities address these issues?
Thank you very much for that question. It's a very practical challenge that we have, particularly even in sub-Saharan Africa. And for us, the integrity of taxpayer register and the issues to do with effective risk management, those are the building blocks for an effective tax administration. Now, the challenge mainly is arising from the structural weaknesses, just to build on what Andreas has just talked about here. In typical administration in our region, the Revenue Authority is in a silo. It's operating away from the institutions that provide the data that is used for you to build a tax register. I'll start for a registered company. In most cases, the registered company will run its own database, its own systems. That's if they've got the systems. In other cases, it could be manual, away from the tax administration. So the register of companies will have more companies registered than what you have in the revenue administration if the two systems are not talking to each other. The second issue is the civil registration system. In most countries, the civil registration system is manual. And unlike maybe here, where a social security number, you can use it for a number of different transactions. In developing countries, a number, a tax certification number, a social security, it's like you have a number for each of the interactions that you have. So as a result, you find that there's no single point of engagement between the civil registration system, as an example, and the revenue authorities. And in most administrations, the civil registration process is still manual. So you have cases where dead people's identities are being used to create tax records, for example. So that creates a major loophole. And for us, I think the fundamental issue in terms of tax registration lies in ensuring that the tax administration is integrated to the ecosystem for company registration, for civil registration, and then you have a basis on which now to build your register. And then on top of that, you go now into the third-party data validations. Is there another transaction that these players are conducting in the broader ecosystem? Are they dealing with government, suppliers of goods and services to government, or other private sectors? And that interface now between the revenue administration and the other third-party players, it could be government departments, the ministries responsible for lands, the ministries responsible for finance, and the broader suppliers in the economy. A key component is needed to that. And at a third-tier level now, we'll be looking at a broader integration now with the private sector. And this is where, in our case, we're pursuing the agenda of electronic invoicing. There are players out there conducting transactions, but not in the register for the Revenue Authority. And the fourth tier now is taking it to the global level, where Zambia now, we've joined the Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information. How do we make sure that any illicit flows that could be outside there, you're able to do data matching at a lower level and identify it? So identifying a tax register, having an accurate tax register, particularly in developing countries, would require concerted efforts in building this ecosystem, besides just looking at internally within the tax administration. Where is the tax revenue interacting with other players? At what points of engagements? We have typical cases where a player is active in the economy. They are formal everywhere else. They have a formal identity, formal mobile number, formal bank account, but when it comes to tax administration, they're informal. They're not known there. Those are typical problems we have on the ground. So to involve developing this strong ecosystem where the tax administration is highly integrated into all these touch points that are involved, where the taxpayer is involved. Equally, risk management just builds on that. If your foundation is weak, if the revenue administration is not integrated with other ecosystems, then you have an ineffective risk management, if at all it exists. But where it exists, the key issue is making sure you harvest this data, build also that into knowledge that should be able to drive your compliance risk management. I think that's where the missing link is. So having an effective compliance risk management. And not just covering domestic taxes, but looking at customs as well. Because part of the weakest link starts within the administration. Those of us who are fortunate, we're running both customs and domestic taxes. And we find cases where the active importers, active exporters, when it comes to domestic taxes, they're filing new returns within one administration. Those are typical cases that you find. So this ecosystem must be built from within. You go to third parties and even go up to global level. And covering that, identifying those who are supposed to be registered but not registered, how do you apply risk management in the whole operation of a revenue authority? That's what I can say in a nutshell. Yeah.
Very good, very interesting. I'm afraid I have to contain myself because maybe if we have time after this round, we can maybe ask you to say something about your digitalization strategy that you have in mind, because you sort of very much into the digital transformation. So how important is that for instance, digital ID and the issues? But maybe we do that after finishing this round. Okay. So next question is for you, Gabriela. Welcome also. And so question to you is, what lessons did you learn from the DG reform assessment approach and the multi-country peer-to-peer TADAT workshops?
Can you hear me well? Good afternoon,
everyone.
Yeah,
we hear you well.
Very pleased. Thank you. Very pleased to be here with you this afternoon to celebrate the 10th anniversary of TADAT's achievements. The experience that I will share with you this afternoon is rather recent, but I think it's an interesting take on the way how we actually work with TADAT, how we use TADAT assessment in the European Union. I myself represent the Directorate General in the European Commission that is focusing on support member states with structural reforms. So what we do is we focus on the design of the reforms, but also, and most importantly, more and more, we also accompany the member states' administrations along the implementation of the reforms. And we do it across all the sectors in the economy. Myself represent now the area of taxation. We work also on demand, so we engage with the tax administrations when they want to engage in reform projects. It was only actually back in 2022 when we were looking at how we could use TADAT for our tax administrations in the European Union. We offered the chance to use it, and we have now 3 countries, Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece, who are almost close to finalizing the project. And this is the experience that I would like to share with you today. The reason why I could not be in Washington with you today is actually because we are launching another multi-country TADAT assessment with new member states. It's Czechia, Slovakia, and Malta, and we are here also with the colleagues from the IMF and from the TADAT Assessment Secretariat who are joining our country teams. So also greetings to them to this. So on our experience, I would like to share basically 3 key points here. And they relate primarily to the way how we actually work in DG Reform through the projects with tax administrations that are based on demand. The 3 points relate firstly to the way how we work. We work more and more in a multi-country way. Secondly, what we do with the TADAT assessment through our projects, we don't end up there. We don't end up with the assessments. We continue to accompany the administrations further. So embedding the follow-up after the TADAT assessment is part of the project that we are launching now and that we are almost closing in the other 3 countries. And thirdly, what is mostly important at the very end, but cannot be missed, is support with communication, engagement with stakeholders, campaigns, and others. With the multi-country way of working, it has been increasing in the past years, the way how we work more and more. You may wonder how one can actually achieve to address the key challenges of one administration in one country and at the same time do it in one go for all of us. I mean, or more of the countries that are part of our projects. The way we do it is through a really good structured project design, so that we capture actually both elements. We leverage on the similarities of the regions, of the countries that participate, but at the same time we take time and dedicate the resources also to the individual work with each of the tax administrations. At the same time, what we have been doing here with the 3 countries, and we actually start the same way of work together with the new 3 countries, is that some of the activities happen simultaneously, and they all happen together. So these countries meet each other, the administrations, colleagues meet each other for the first time and continue working together throughout 15 months, 20 months of time. So they train together, they learn the methodology together, we organize the assessments at the same time, and the teams have then a chance to exchange also on each other's scorings, and this way they really learn. So the lessons learned is what everybody has been already saying here this afternoon. It is really the way how we work, an excellent opportunity to create a community of practice. We learn from each other, and we facilitate it more and more, and colleagues really enjoy that. And this way, what is also important for us from the perspective of the Commission, from the European Union, is that we see that this way you kind of embed in the DNA of the people the ownership of the reform process. It starts from bottom up, and this is really the basis of successful structural reform. Secondly, what I would like to mention, and rather briefly, is the way how we follow up on the TADAT's assessment. As I said, we don't stop there, but we continue to work with the administrations on the basis of the assessments. So we further look at the areas that are prone to improvements. We look at which areas to prioritize for further reforms, and we also accompany them along the way to adjust their strategic plans in the administration. And we work also then bottom up with the managers so that the acceptance of the process, of the selection, is justified and accepted. The way the added value here is clear for us, because we see that it creates a little momentum in the administration to actually be aware that something is prone to change, and when it's well communicated and accepted, then the next steps are easier for the people in the administrations. And thirdly, communication. Communication is, in general, or may not be so self-evident feature of a successful tax reform, but the way how we have been seeing reforms go, and the fact that structural reforms really take time and needs to be accepted, need to be understood by the general public, by all the stakeholders, by companies, by people. It is becoming an essential part of the way how we work with the administrations when they decide to reform, to undertake reform and go on the next steps. We also accompany them with a way how to engage with stakeholders and communicate well publicly. And this is really important for not only the political level, but also for all the stakeholders around. So with this, I would like to close my short intervention. TADAT has been really becoming the baseline from where we start the structural reforms, and it's becoming quite a demanded tool that we support also EU member states with. But through the way how we work in DG Reform, we actually do go and accompany the administration a little bit further with the prioritization of the reforms, or with finding a right time to talk and engage with stakeholder community. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. That's much appreciated. On the good example of indeed peer-to-peer exchange, and also the importance of communication. So that point is very well taken. So Mary, we already heard from Modest during his presentation about the repeat TADAT results and the progress that was achieved in Africa. So what do you think maybe the reason for that? And maybe you can also share with us how you see the value of the repeat TADATs.
First of all, I want to say that it's a keen observation. Indeed, the repeat assessments have clearly shown that countries have made advances in terms of implementing the reforms that were suggested. And I tried to look at the repeat assessments in Kenya, in Rwanda, in Zambia, Uganda, and South Africa when I was preparing for this. And I just want to use the example of Uganda again, like the good professor next to me said earlier. A lot of this is really not in the public domain, so you have to dig a little deeper and use influence to get this data. But I want to use an example from Uganda. And in the initial assessment, which was done in 2015, they scored a C in effective risk management. And in the repeat assessment that was done in 2019, they did get an A, showing that there was, substantive improvement. And I want to say, to give some of the reasons that I think, Modest gave 3. I agree with you that I think a combination of the 3 is really why the repeat assessments are good. But I want to give some factors that I think contribute to this. The first is that the TADAT assessments, the repeat assessments, provide focused reform priorities. And so the countries are able to focus on key areas that were identified as weak. The partners are also focused on those to try and help them to overcome these weaknesses. And that is a key advantage of the repeat assessments. And here I want to say that if you look at what has influenced a lot of our work, in 2023 alone, ATAF was able to deliver at least 180 technical assistance missions in the different countries, and most of those were really based on what had been found out during these TADAT assessments. So I can imagine even the other partners also do the same. So the second is there is a high level of commitment that comes with TADAT assessments. And I want to say here, I can't remember who mentioned the fact that usually the focus is on the administration and then less so on the policy. But with TADAT, because there's always an involvement of the Ministry of Finance and the other key players, it creates a sense of ownership. So once the report comes out, everybody is, sort of like, it's an awakening for everybody. And they say, well, we need to, get up and smell the coffee and do our work and do it right. So you find that these repeat assessments, because everybody is looking at that. But I also, when I listened very keenly when Mr. Banda was speaking, there's also an issue of, there's also an advantage of now comparing yourself to those who you think are doing well and to see what you can learn from them and what you can teach them. So I think that level of commitment, that level of peer support is really, really critical. For me, those are the key things that I think repeat assessments provide. Then whether these repeated assessments are highly useful, yes, I definitely agree that they are very useful because they provide the countries with an opportunity to see if they have, improved. So the first one is really, they help in identifying reform priorities and strategic plans. Again, Mr. Banda did mention that they do even have a dedicated team that looks at those reforms and how they are being implemented. If you look at all the countries, almost all of them have those kinds of teams. And so the repeat assessments then, once they happen, they find that the teams have sort of like tried to strengthen all the bolts where they previously they had been loose. So I think that is a key area. And then the second is in terms of measuring the progress. So these repeat assessments also help when you go into these countries for repeat assessments, the interactions that we've had, you find they're very excited about them, but at the same time, they're also apprehensive and wondering, are we going to be scored well? Have we improved? Or are we still stagnating? So for me, I think that is another important use. And then a critical thing is identifying persistent challenges. Like the register that we talked about. I think, so identifying those challenges, again, helps the revenue administrations to deploy their resources better because they know their weakest points and therefore they try and address those. And then finally, strengthening partner support. And I know, because I've spoken to a couple of development partners who sponsor this, and when we are having these engagements, they talk to us about these assessments. I know we've spoken to the FCDO, to our colleagues in the Netherlands, and many others, and all these assessments help them to focus better their support to these countries. So I think the repeat assessments are really good, and I think they help better. Why they are more prevalent in Africa, I think for those very reasons, because they now understand where the problems are. They also are keen about the repeat assessments. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you, Mary. So TADAT also strengthened commitment. I think that's a very, very important lesson. So James, last question to you. You already spoke about sort of how TADAT results can be used in research on sort of performance. We also heard about ISORA. If you were the boss of TADAT and from a research perspective, what would you wish for? What would be your sort of ideal TADAT measurement?
What would I wish for? First, I'll repeat and emphasize several of my earlier 2 points on what I would wish for. As a research economist outside the IMF, first, I think TADAT needs to do a better job of making its assessments publicly available to researchers. Economists, at least academic economists, are cheap dates. Give us the data and we'll work for free. For the most part. Second, I think TADAT needs to do a better job of linking the TADAT scores with the true outputs of development outcomes, which I think we're fundamentally interested in. And I think that's starting to happen. But what else would I wish for? A couple things. One, I was participating recently in a discussion of what the US IRS might do with its increased budget, which seems to be decreasing over time. A common refrain was whether the money should be spent on more enforcement or versus better services. And the common answer was that this really depends on which strategy yields a higher return on investment, about which on the enforcement side we know, on the services side we don't. Well, calculating this return on investment requires, among other things, quantifying the effects of an improvement in services, for example, and especially it requires knowing the cost of the investment. And these costs, as far as I can tell, and I'm not privy to most of the TADAT data, don't always show up in the TADAT documents that, at least the ones that I've seen. It's essential to quantify as much as possible the possible cost of tax administration improvements, which I suspect is going on now, and it's just, as an outsider, I don't have access to that. Finally, as I read the various research papers, words like correlation and associated with appear frequently when talking about the connection between TADAT scores and outcomes of various types when that work takes place, leading to a frequent statement along the lines of, it is not possible to isolate the direct effects of any capacity development provided. In the lingo of economists, what these statements imply is that research does not have a clear identification strategy that allows causal conclusions to be drawn on the effects of tax administration reforms on outcomes. So what can be done here? Well, two specific suggestions. One, which actually shows up in the ADAN paper that I mentioned before, is synthetic control methods. Now, they argue in the paper that doesn't really generate the true causal identification. I'm not entirely convinced of that, in part because I have a couple papers that use synthetic control where I've argued that at least under some assumptions, you can make causal, at least quasi-causal conclusions from these. Looking at the effects of flat tax reforms, for example. I'm happy to provide that paper to anybody foolish enough to be interested in it. Second, my own conceptual framework is to think of essentially a tax administration production function, as suggested by Richard Byrd, the late, great Richard Byrd. Where inputs are related to outputs. So what are these inputs and outputs? Well, the outputs that I have in mind are essentially what I talked about earlier. not the TADAT POAs, but the more fundamental true output that I discussed earlier, like tax gaps and things like that. As for inputs, I believe that the POAs and the 32 indicators and the 55 dimensions are really the inputs that we're interested in that are related to the outputs of the tax administration. In any event, what I would hope for is that all these inputs and outputs would be quantified, as really is already done for inputs. And in fact, the beauty of the TADAT framework is that these input, grade a B in any of these dimensions, is supposed to mean the same thing whether it takes place in Uganda or Botswana. So that's a uniform statement that you don't necessarily have for ESORA's data. And the relationship between inputs and outputs would be used to estimate a tax administration production function, an efficient frontier, and the resulting estimates would show how a change in an input would lead to a change in the output, and would ultimately be used to draw specific lessons for specific countries on how specific administrative improvements lead to specific development outcomes. And in fact, there's a well-developed methodology for estimating production functions that has been applied more frequently to tax administration. I will immodestly say I have a paper on this that is flawed in many significant ways, but nonetheless shows the basic methodology that uses data envelopment analysis and stochastic frontier analysis. Fortunately, I'm working with people who know far more about these things than I do. I'm kind of a dilettante on this stuff, but so I can throw around the terms, but I need to be working with somebody who actually knows what they're doing. Maybe this approach is not feasible. I believe that it is, and it's been applied elsewhere. And I would encourage TADAT to consider both synthetic control methods and production function methods in terms of additional things that I would wish for. Again, I applaud TADAT for the tremendous contributions that it has made and that I'm sure it will continue to make. And I think everyone in TADAT should be applauded for these efforts.
Thank you so much, James. And I think we all listen, and I think the real boss of TADAT has also listened very well. Thanks a lot for your suggestions. So our time is almost up, but I do want to ask the floor if there's some burning questions. We can take 2 or so. There's one, and there's the minister in the front. Please, state your name and...
Thank you. I'm Srinivas Gurujada. I'm head of PIFA Secretariat, quite similar to TADAT. And we recently did a stock take of PFM tools. There are 64 today, and I would like to compliment TADAT Secretariat for being one of the most well-maintained frameworks, respected and growing. Hearty congratulations to TADAT Secretariat and everyone. My question is to the Commissioner General. Zambia has been an example of using the frameworks, the PIFA framework for overall PFM and TADAT framework for tax administration. What has been your experience in bringing all this together to enhance the overall effectiveness of PFM reforms in the country? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then we take the other question, Juan. And then I'll give you the floor for the final word.
Thank you, Ruud, and thank you for the panelists. I want to just make a reflection on something that James was saying in terms of what do we measure with TADAT. And when we initiated TADAT, the main focus of TADAT is outcomes. What are the main outcomes of a tax administration system, and I underline system because it's not organization, it's system. And when we set the outcomes, there is some of the areas where the outcome is very easy to focus. For example, filing and payment. A good outcome is to have a very high filing and payment rates. Very simple. However, in the several areas that TADAT tried to assess the tax administration system, is not easy, is not straightforward. We, for example, discuss for compliance or the effectiveness in terms of audit, etc. What we discussed at the beginning said, well, the best thing, we should measure non-compliance. Well, very few countries were measuring compliance. And this is why we created the REGA program, in order to help countries to systematize this. So when there was not an evident outcome indicator, what was the approach we followed? We said, okay, let's try to identify some good practices that countries has good outcome. And then we follow this indirect approach. So when you see the TADAT framework, you have both. In some cases, you really have outcomes. In other cases, you have good practices. But TADAT framework is not about good practices. Good practices is an indirect way to say this country should produce good outcomes. But again, the focus is outcome. And it's an outcome of the tax administration system again. So when James referred to the kind of outcome development, this is well beyond the tax administration system. For example, when you consider, let's say, tax revenues ratio, yes, it's good that the kind of impact of the tax administration improved that. But if you have a tax policy change that goes exactly in the opposite direction, you're not going to get an increase in tax revenue ratio. So is this implies that the tax administration is bad? No, because it's a much complex set of consequences. So I would like to call this attention because sometimes I see that because we measure a lot of good practices, we said, okay, this is TADAT is about good practices, but it's not. What we measure in good practice said, okay, we don't have a good outcome indicators, but we observed some good tax administration that had good outcome. And said, okay, what are the good practices there? And then we said, if you do some good practices, well, you should have some good outcomes. But we are working with countries in how to systematize better measurement of outcomes. And again, I repeat, our REGAP program that tried to measure tax gap in VAT, income tax, etc., this is the purpose. Because when we launched TADAT, there was none. Very few countries performed this. So when I see challenges in the future, I ask myself, how much we have progressed in developing new outcome measures in tax administration. And this is part of the second panel. So it's an advertisement for the second panel that I will be chairing. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Juan. Much appreciated. And now we're talking about advertisement for nice sessions. Tomorrow is another session which talks about various sort of quantifications of tax that can be used in identifying good practices. So RA Gap is part of that, ISORA, but also others. So just some little advertisement because I'm moderating that session. I want to give the last word to the Commissioner General.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the question, Srini, that you raised. I think if you look at any administration, it's undisputable the fact that you cannot run tax policy so disjoint from the administration side. And the TADAT provides us with that platform to identify what are the priorities from the tax administration perspective. What are the key reforms that need to be driven? And in our environment, TADAT was actually sanctioned by the Minister of Finance. So you can see a keen interest from the Minister of Finance to see that TADAT is implemented. But when we come to policy also, there's an interplay. There are policy measures that will have an impact on administration, and the two have to work together in tandem. You remember in Zambia, you were in Zambia, we worked on under the Public Financial Reform Program, we worked on a number of reforms under PFMRP that touched on tax administration and so forth. And if you look at TADAT, there are some aspects there. For example, the fact that the revenue administration must be connected, the systems must be connected to the IFMIS for finance. Those are some of the key priorities that we take up and provide a linkage between what the policy side is pushing and the administration side is pushing. And I must mention that Zambia is one of the few countries that has developed its own tax administration system. And in terms of the importance of that issue, is that the part of the TADAT reforms that needed to be done, we had the capacity on our own to implement. As an example, when a company is registered now in Zambia, immediately the Revenue Authority issues a taxpayer identification number with the institution that issues the registration. And previously, the two systems would have totally different numbers. And the other reforms, including the interfaces that are being done with Ministry of Finance, IFMIS, all these now being driven internally as part of the development phase. So that's part of the issues that we're dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for all the panelists for their contribution. And going back to Jimena.
Thank you so much, Ruud, our esteemed panelists, that of course are very engaged audience, for your expertise and commitment to fostering engaging dialogue about the quite remarkable impact of TADAT over the years, if I may say. We invite you now to join us for a short coffee break. please feel free to relax, refresh, and network with your peers. We will resume our program promptly at 4 p.m. Thank you, and enjoy your break. Thank you. Thank you for your prompt return. And let's get ready for the next exciting segment of our event about the future of TADAT. We will commence with an insightful presentation on the preliminary outline of the future TADAT framework presented by Paul Martens, a TADAT expert and former colleague from the Fiscal Affairs Department. This introduction will set the stage for a deeper exploration through a panel discussion moderated by Juan Toro, Deputy Director of the Fiscal Affairs Department. The panel will examine areas within the TADAT framework that may require adaptations to ensure its continued effectiveness. Our goal is to ensure that TADAT remains robust, relevant, and a valuable tool for country authorities and capacity development providers aiming to assess and strengthen their tax administration systems. Please stay engaged as we navigate these pivotal discussions together. I would like to now call on our stage to our esteemed moderator, Juan Toro, and our distinguished panelists. Please, Deborah, Tuan, Monica, Marina, Kosue, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Juan and our esteemed panelists. Please. I invite you all to take your seats, make yourselves comfortable as we prepare to delve into riveting discussion on the future of TADAT. Very good. And without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Paul Martens to lead us through the presentation of the future of TADAT framework. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amina, for that introduction. Good afternoon to everyone here. It's my privilege to be here today at the invitation of the TADAT Secretariat to give you some insights into the future of the Field Guide 2025, as I refer to it. But it would be remiss of me not to do a little bit of a presentation on, or give you a bit of history to do with TADAT. In fact, I can remember walking into this organisation back in 2012, my first day at the IMF. And I think one of my initial meetings, one of the things that I was asked to be involved with was the development of an assessment tool for tax administrations. And that set the scene for the next couple of years, amongst other things, keeping me very busy. So at some point, I think it was around in 2014, as we've already mentioned today, I had the privilege of leading some of the initial TADAT pilot assessments. Zambia, as we've talked about today, Norway, and also South Africa were three that come to mind. And that was a proving of this concept of TADAT, the refinement of the product, particularly around good practices and the scoring methodology that we were looking at. A lot has passed since then, and it was interesting when I walked in at the front door today, I saw the current field guide, the 2019 version of the field guide. I had to go one better and bring the original field guide today as well, the yellow version. And then when I was going through and finding that, would you believe I came across the TADAT Framework Pocket Reference Guide? Now, for those of you that have got a big pocket, this may fit. I don't know why I kept that, but it's a collector's item, I'm sure. So I might donate that to the TADAT Secretariat when I leave. Talking about reviews, and that's the point of the subject today, The first review, which again I was privileged to do a lot of things in the IMF, but one of the areas in 2014 that we started to do with the new field guide in 2015. The first review we started to look at after about 3 or 4 years, because there were some issues, not issues, but improvements that could be made in the original field guide. And that started in around 2018, where we looked at what we could improve, and then resulted in the second and the current version of the field guide being released in April 2019, as you would have seen. What were the changes? What were some of the things that we looked at in that? Well, there were the changes to the core taxes and the definition, and this was principally to bring into the framework around core taxes, domestic excise, where it met the principles of what a core tax should be. So that was a specific addition to in that particular field guide. There was also the revamp of a couple of the performance outcome areas. Now, particularly POA 2 and POA 6. I referenced POA 2 because it was all about effective risk management. And this is where we saw institutional risk. We still have a big focus on compliance risk, but we saw institutional risk be split between what we call operational risk and operational risk and human capital risk. And there was a big focus on human capital risk, a new indicator and dimension that was assigned to that particular area. The extension of POA 6 around accurate reporting and declarations had 2 new dimensions that were created and input into the field guide. One looking at the audit quality assurance program, and the other looking at the effectiveness of the audit program itself, and they were quite important. Now, along with that, there were a number of enhancements to things like the glossary of terms, but there was also other areas of the field guide that were improved. To give you some, I suppose, emphasis on the size of what was changed, field guide 2015, the original one, had 27 indicators and 47 measured dimensions. Field Guide 2019, we saw that increase to 32 indicators and 55 dimensions. And for those of you looking at the size of this document, we went from around 130 pages to 190 pages. So it was a significant volume increase in the actual field guide itself. And I think we also mentioned today, later that year, I think in around November, well, I know in November 2019, the subnational field guide was released and published. So that leads us to the current review and what we're here to talk about today. So I'll just make sure my papers don't fall everywhere. So on the basis of TADAT's good performance over the first 10 years, and we've heard a lot about that today, and so I'm not going to elaborate too much on that, but from going forward, we see no need to make significant changes to the structure or the methodology of the tool itself, and that's an important point. But given the changing landscape in which tax administrations now work, we need to ensure that the tool remains relevant. So some points to note. TADAT will remain an evaluation tool, so we will not be intending to extend the scope of the tool to incorporate greater detail on the development of reform plans. Those of you that understand the different phases of TADAT, phase 4, the final phase of the process itself, talks about post-assessment dialogue, okay? And that's basically what happens after the assessment is finalised. So it will remain an evaluation tool. The POA structure will remain in place. The 9 POAs that we all know, we all are very fond of, will remain in place. But there is expected to be new dimensions and some new indicators based on both an update of good practices, which still remain the foundation of the tool, and catering for changes in the tax administration environment that I've just alluded to before. So in undertaking this review, we appreciated very early on that TADAT must take into account at least 3 things that impact on tax administrations today. The first one is technological advances. So the use of technology itself, along with enhancements in such things as data collection and analytics. The second area we need to take account of is economic globalisation, particularly in the area of international taxation. And the third area is the changing societal values. And here I'm talking about key focus areas of gender and climate change. So these three things are clear in our mind when we go forward in reviewing the field guide. In doing this, however, we must be particularly cognizant, particularly in the area of technological advances, of the different levels of tax administration capacity when it comes to determining recognised international good practice. This still means that we'll identify it, absolutely, but we'll need to appreciate, particularly in our performance measurement framework, that advanced administrations will have a much higher level of technical capability. So our methodology. Let's look at the review and how we've consulted so far. As you know, I'm sure you do know, and those of you that don't, there was an external review undertaken last year on TADAT, and those findings will be included in this current review of the field guide. But since then, we've undertaken what we consider to be a very broad and most inclusive consultative approach as possible. This commenced late last year, where we went out to a number of high users of TADAT, okay, both individuals and groups, and sought some responses from them. And we received 15 quite detailed responses. Since then, a wider range of stakeholders, including the broader international community, has been encouraged to provide feedback. Much of this was done during the regional workshops that have been mentioned already today, and they were undertaken back from February until quite recently. And they were using a prepared questionnaire. Now, those of you that might have seen this questionnaire would have noted how structured that questionnaire was. The reason for that, it was a lesson learned from the 2018 review that we had to have a structured questionnaire to make sure people understood what we were trying to achieve by this revision. We're still receptive to further feedback, but as our timeline towards the end of this presentation will show, that time is fast running out. Most interesting now, what types of feedback have we received so far? Suggestions have ranged, of course, from how the tool should be used to the content, the specific content covering all chapters of the field guide and the related appendices. What are the most common feedback areas? Well, there are three. We've had a range of suggestions around good practice changes, the performance measurement framework, and changes to the dimensions and indicator structure. So for good practices, these evolve. We understand that what was good in 2018, 2019 has now been either surpassed or removed completely. So we have to keep pace with these good practice changes that form the basis or the foundation of the tool. We've talked about the performance measurement framework, the scoring, the ABCD scoring. Now, 55 dimensions, 45 feedback respondents there are 45 dimensions have been identified in our feedback that require some amendment. And as I said before, we received some very detailed submissions in the feedback, so quite extensive amount of feedback in that particular area. And changes to dimensions and indicators. Things like, for example, should we still use telephone call waiting times in indicator P39. Also, a new dimension proposed for payment in POA 5 around initiatives used by tax administrations to encourage on-time payments. So those types of things that we need now to consider. And I should have reiterated before, is at the moment we are gathering and considering what is there. We have yet to make decisions. Some other feedback areas, the scoring method. As you know, we've got the two methods, M1 and M2, M1 being the mutual dependency type scoring method, M2 being the average. It's not around the scoring itself, the use of the two methods, but where they're actually used. So there's been some strong suggestions and quite powerful suggestions around whether or not we should move from M1 to M2 for certain indicators. So we'll consider that. The assessor checklist of questions. Dearly loved section of the field guide. In fact, one of the strengths of the field guide, one of the strengths of the field guide. So we've looked at those types of things, and the pre-assessment questionnaire, which is quite important. Simplification of Table 2, which is the movement in the taxpayer register, and a rework of Table 14, which is around dispute finalisation of things that are clearly in our scope. So apart from that, one of the things that also came up in our feedback was how we deal with small administrations, because often administrations are quite small, have difficulty undertaking the full range of TADAT activities that we need to do. Just moving on now to the actual graph that shows the POA responses by these most common areas. It just gives you a sense of the numbers of feedback that we received for the different areas, whether they be on good practices, whether they be on indicators or dimensions, or whether they relate to the performance measurement framework. So on the basis of the feedback that we've received so far, we've got a lot to do, okay? Good practice changes, as I've mentioned before, to keep the product contemporary in its nature. We are looking at the technology, incorporating how tax administration's digital strategies and IT systems are keeping up with the pace of change and supporting efficient administration of taxes. The use of tax automation, AI, leveraging technology to provide enhanced services, providing direct taxpayer interaction while maintaining data and information security. Basically, this is where we'll be looking to see how tax administration may be adopting terms like GovTech as part of the government's whole approach to public sector management. The extent to which tax administrations are becoming more data-driven. For example, pre-filling declarations, particularly VAT declarations from data generated from e-invoicing will be something that we're looking at exploiting new sources of data to be used in the compliance risk management approach. And how tax administrations are satisfying wider reporting obligations and addressing international tax risks. Looking also at whether tax administrations collect gender-specific data, how a tax administration's business processes and its human resource strategies are geared towards treating all taxpayers fairly, irrespective of gender, and how the administration's HR strategies facilitate reconciliation of private and professional life and the promotion of women to positions of responsibility. And lastly, we're looking at how tax administrations are rising to the climate change challenge, both organisationally and operationally, through policies on reducing organisations' gas emissions and energy consumption, things like carrying out carbon audits and responsible purchasing policies. So a lot of work to do, particularly around the indicator and dimension split, and we expect some change to that. A retweak of the assessor checklist of questions. The performance management framework is something that we're also looking at doing in quite some detail, but it's something that we need to make sure our good practices, our indicator dimension structure is set before we then move into the actual scoring mechanism itself. We've had suggestions on the performance assessment report itself. There was, particularly now, with repeat assessments, how that can be improved to capture better findings from the previous assessments and what has happened in the current assessment. Certainly, my takeaway from today is how we reinforce that message about publication of the performance assessment report, how we actually do that. And what springs to mind immediately, it comes up 3 times. It comes up when the initiation phase, when we first talk to the administration or the sponsors of the actual assessments itself. It comes up at the exit interview where we're presenting the findings of the performance assessment report, and then it comes up again at the end of the quality assurance process for the report when the final report is released. And of course, there has been some suggestions on how the field guide should better provide a platform for more effective collaboration between development partners and countries that seek their support through and beyond the TADAT process. And any change here needs to be very much aligned with the fact that TADAT will remain an evaluation tool itself. Our timeline, just briefly, as you can see, it's quite tight. We're here already in June 2024, and by the end of next month, we're looking to produce a preliminary draft of Field Guide 2025. That then will go through further analysis and refinement, and then a formal approval process for publishing of the Field Guide in the first quarter of 2025. And just to briefly recap, we're focusing on ensuring that TADAT itself remains that contemporary product and the preferred diagnostic assessment tool for tax administrations, and we're confident to do that. We will continue our partner engagement. We see that as critical to good outcomes for the product itself. Involvement of the Technical Advisory Group and the TADAT Steering Committee is imperative as suggested changes are identified. And lastly, the TAC community will need to be informed of what we're doing, and they have been already through our process and seeking feedback. But when the field guide is finalised, then the continuation of the training and familiarisation with the new field guide. So that is something that will continue as well. So I think that's about it. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll hand you back to you.
Thank you, Paul, for your excellent presentation. Now I would like to hand over to Juan, who will moderate the panelists' discussion. Juan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jimena, and thank you very much for inviting me to this really milestone in TADAT. Something that, thank you, Paul, for the presentation. Something you forgot to mention is that when you came to the fund, you went to my office and said, okay, we need to develop this. And we started the journey, as people like to say. And just to give a little bit of additional background, historical background, we initiated the TADAT development somehow in response to a request from the PIFA Steering Committee. Because the PIFA Steering Committee, as those familiar with PIFA framework, has just 3 indicators on the tax administration side. So we met the PIFA Steering Committee and said, why don't we develop a drill-down tool for tax administration? We did the assessment. I said, okay, it's possible, but it's not going to be a drill-down tool. It will be a sister framework because the tax administration system is as complex as what PIFA is measuring. And this is the way we initiated the journey. And I would like to introduce the topic and the panelists, but first making a couple of comments regarding the future exercise. And Paul did a very good description of how the future exercise is ongoing. And one aspect is remind us ourselves what I mentioned in the intervention before, that TADAT framework, again, is about how we measure the performance of our revenue administration, tax administration system. And the way to do this is try to focus on outcomes. So when we don't have robust outcome indicators, then we go to practices of countries that's supposed to deliver well. So in this regard, for example, thinking now in the GovTech as a dimension that kind of more developed administration has been incorporating in order to produce better outcomes. So we shouldn't lose focus on that ultimately we want the outcome part, because GovTech cut across many of the POAs. So when we are talking about filing and payment, for example, if you are digitalized, you have a much better outcome versus not having. If you are talking about the effectiveness of a tax administration, if you have good database, data mining, etc., you will have better outcome on effectiveness. But the ultimate goal is the outcome, is not the fancy IT systems. So I think this is something I would like to stress. The second part I would like to stress is the idea of the repeat assessment. And this is something that we need to think further in the following sense. There was a presentation or intervention by the DG Reform representative. We have been working with DG Reform in Southeast Europe with the notion that by default, when we plan a TADAT assessment, there is already a TADAT follow-up assessment already in the plan. Because TADAT, in addition to be a diagnostic of a tax administration, also is a way to measure progress with reform agendas. So in this sense, I think we will need to work more on this, because only 1/5 of the 150 something TADAT has been repeated. So it's a very low proportion. So in this sense, looking ahead, when we plan a TADAT, we should immediately discuss with the authorities, okay, we should plan a TADAT, let's say 3 years on the road, because we are going to embark in a reform agenda, and we want to have the similar framework for measuring if we have made progress. That's the rationale behind. So it shouldn't be seen in isolation. And in addition, not to be seen in isolation from that perspective, also it shouldn't be seen in isolation from the more broad tax system reform. And here I make the link with the so-called medium-term revenue strategy. What we are trying to help countries is to have better tax systems. And by tax system, we are talking about the policy framework, the administration framework, the legal framework. And this is where we have been developing in the Platform for Collaboration on Tax, the concept of the medium-term revenue strategy that has the whole component of the tax system, including the tax administration system. So in this sense, it's very important to place TADAT reform agenda that are kind of driven by TADAT and TADAT reassessment in the context of the tax system reform. Because ultimately, it's very important for us is to place the tax administration reform in the overall context, trying that the whole government embrace the reform in this regard, because it will have more support. We know that tax administration compliance is very complex, particularly when you touch vested interest. That's why you need a broader context. It cannot be seen in isolation, just a tax administration exercise. This is too short. So we need to put it in that broad context. Okay, so for this panel, I have 5 distinguished panelists. And on my right, we have Deborah Adams, Division Chief of Revenue Administration 1 in FAD. Next is Tuanmi Lee, Lead Economist, World Bank. To my side, Monica Caligiuri, Sector Lead Specialist, Tax Administration, Inter-American Development Bank. On my left, I have Marina Rocha, Executive Project Lead, Brazilian Revenue Administration. And on my left as well, Kozue Ichijama, Public Management Specialist, Asian Development Bank. So we have a good variety of thinking here, and I'm going to exploit this. We're supposed to finish this panel by 5:10. So I will ask the panelists to be sharp, precise in their responses. So Deborah, starting with you. So in the presentation, Paul makes some reference, not so explicitly, but what we have heard is that there is some people requesting that TADAT go to the next steps, meaning developing sort of a reform, assessment, et cetera, et cetera. As a CD providers, because Revenue Administration Division really leads a lot of TADAT, what are your thoughts on this? do you think the 9 POAs, the core taxes, and the TADAT scoring methodology remain relevant today? Deborah?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here. I find it, I may not sound it, but I'm quite excited. And because at the IMF, we really feel that the TADAT is an invaluable tool as part of our capacity development. It really is. It's one of the main tools we use to assess baseline performance and identify the weakest areas in a tax administration. But of course, it's not just about the results, the scoring. As someone said earlier, perhaps the scoring is sort of something we shouldn't be so focused on. It's what you do next. And I very much appreciated the Commissioner General from Zambia giving us almost a case study of what you do next. You take that information. And we would always encourage countries to take a pause and not go, you know, you get your scores and your results one day and the next day you plan your future. No, take a pause, take a beat, think about the results, and then go to the next steps once you've had a chance to absorb this. And I also don't support TADAT itself being the means to do the next stage of your reform planning and setting your reform agenda. There are many people representing organizations on this stage and in the audience here who are already doing excellent work in this space to help tax administrations around the world go that next step to develop their own reform agenda. And many of us have a trusted advisor relationship with countries already. So there may be, I really liked the data about mixed teams from different institutions supporting TADATs in countries. And amongst those teams, there's likely to be one sort of more, you know, the trusted advisor who's the first person who has sort of the strategic advice. And they're probably the best person or best institution placed to take the country forward with their reform agenda. I'm trying to be quick one. Okay. I think actually Gabriella from the EC also gave a good example there of that trusted advisor role. So much of what I wanted to say has already been said by others, but I think that means with so many partners, so many stakeholders feeling very strongly in a positive way about this tool, we're all using it to take our support forward with countries. On your question on relevance, and I appreciated Paul's discussion there. The issue is keeping TADAT up to date with the evolution of good practices in tax administration. And I know working with some of the more highly digitalized tax administrations, you know, and you talked about evolving technologies, TADAT has to keep up that. But one of my mantras is about keeping the basics, you know, getting the basics right. And I really think TADAT can't lose sight, can't lose focus, can't skip over an assessment of are the basic foundations of good tax administration across the core functions in place. And I think it does that very well and needs to not lose that. Many administrations, they come to us and they want to do something clever with AI or machine learning. And then when we start working with them, we realize they don't have any of the foundations in place of their compliance risk management or their analytics or their data to even think about that. So I think TADAT brings us back to those basics. And I certainly would see a continuing focus on the core national taxes. This is where the revenue is. This is why countries want their tax system to be working efficiently, is to collect the maximum revenue. Briefly on scoring, I think the scoring is generally sound. I'm interested there's been so much feedback on scoring, so I'd be interested perhaps to hear a bit more at some stage about that. So yes, appreciate that it can be reviewed and you know, keeping dimensions and indicators as up to date as possible would be probably my main comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Tuan, Modesta showed us some statistic where we have more than 150 TADAT assessment, but only 1/5 of them has been repeated, so 28, something like that. So what action can be taken and by whom to continue to expand the TADAT footprint across the world? So your views.
Thank you for your question. And before I go into directly to your question, let me first reaffirm, the line of the presentation that Modest already made in the previous section. The relevancy and utility of the TADAT as the global preferred diagnostic tool, and the bank using that, and we extending that. And we are very proud. The bank has been like the partner since the early days of TADAT. And before we talk about like the what donors or what the development partners community can do to support like the expanding the TADAT footprint globally, let us also understand a little bit about the challenges at hand. And the actions that are useful, that are also the actions that need to mitigate the risk arising from those challenges. So in this very quick talk, I would like to mention only about two groups of the challenges. One is revenue administration reforms, or revenue reforms in general are always highly politically charged. And in our World Bank review of the lending operations, resistant to change or resistant to reform, change management always pose some sort of the barrier to reforms. And the second part that is really about the fragmentation to the concept of reforms. Within the revenue administration, in many cases that we can observe, that revenue administrations really are averse to comprehensive reforms. They may look at certain part of like institutional reforms, maybe change management, HR, but not looking at, say, business processing, process re-engineering, or maybe ICT, digitalization, and so on, that Deborah also mentioned, briefly in your talk. And within the Ministry of Finance, tax policy department and tax administration agency may not always agree on the setting and also the priorities and also the sequencing for reforms. We see that in the challenging to establish the MTIS, the midterm revenue strategy. So there is a lack of the concerted efforts on the Ministry of Finance side to really, and also revenue administration side, to demand like for rigorous diagnostics, including the TADAT. Now, to mitigate those challenges, the risk from those challenges, I would think of three main groups of actions. And those of the actions are also behind the concept of our new World Bank TADAT project. One, a ground-up approach. We, from our experience, on the ground, effective conversation, dialogues with revenue administration, tax policy department, Ministry of Finance could help us garner like some sort of the political commitment at the highest level. And we also encourage like the Ministry of Finance to engage in like wider stakeholder participation. And so that is really the pressure on reforms and also trigger the demand for TADAT. And the other part that I would like to mention in here, that's another action that is really linking TADAT with the following up or maybe complementary TA lending operations. I'm very happy that Andrea and other people, other panelists in the previous session already mentioned, and also you also mentioned, touch upon that. We need not look at TADAT as isolated one-off action. It has to be used as the basis or the baseline for to support like capacity building on the IMF side, or maybe lending analytical support from at the World Bank side. And the last part I would like to, the last kind of action that I would like to emphasize in here is really we need to work together. We need to ramp up our collaboration with the TADAT Secretariat, among the TADAT partners, and with all the technical assistance providers. We want to speak in one voice. We want to make sure that the TADAT, country TADATs are of consistency and high quality. And we want to support countries to cross-fertilize the lessons learned from TADAT assessment through jointly organizing some sort of the regional global events where the administrations can sit together and they can exchange knowledge and experience.
Thank you. Monica, you have a lot of experience in working in Latin American countries where tax administration has been very innovative. To what extent can this innovation contribute to the updating of the TADAT framework, which is ongoing? So Paul could pay attention to this part.
Thank you, Juan. And firstly, I would like to thank to TADAT Secretariat for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. Respond to your question. There are some biggest problems now in the region that I can mention some. For example, tax evasion, fraud, shadow economy, and there are others. But in order to address these problems that tax administration has to dealing with every day, but that's the problems of tax administration. And it leads to a low revenue collection. And we work with modernization of tax administration. But since 1 decade ago, we noticed that the biggest problems of tax administration is quality of data. Now, if you don't know your taxpayer, you don't know where they are doing, or you don't know where they are located, or their partners, or if the real owner of this firm, it's very difficult for tax administration to address these problems now in terms of region, because it is a problem common for the whole region. And we thought that we could improve the quality of data. And it's important to mention that tax administrations have working very hardly to improve the quality of data using technology. Technology, digitalization, and it leads to data management. Of course, there are some tax administration, they have a more improvement than others because it depends on the budget, the size of tax administration, and also economic situation of the country. But we can mention, for example, in the other panel, in the presentation, also Paul Martin has made, he mentioned electronic invoice. Electronic invoice started almost 20 years ago for Mexico, Brazil, Chile, but in the last decade have expanded for almost all tax administration in the region. And it's a huge step for tax administration because it brought a lot of data now to tax administration. And then they thought, what we are going to do with all this data? Now we need to understand how to deal with. And one step leads to another one. And then tax administration is starting now working with digitalization, not only IT, because when you think about technology, we think about hardware, but they needed to integrate database. Now they needed to integrate with database from other institutions now in the government. And also, we noticed that big data is starting now flowing now in tax administration. And then big data and analytics, we can see how it's changing, how tax administration operate in Latin America. Now the process has changed. With data analytics, tax authorities can better identify compliance risks, and manage enforcement strategy better. But as Juan mentioned in the beginning, it's a way to do this. It's not the outcome. No, it's a way to improve the outcome that we are expecting, and we're expecting better tax revenue, but better tax collection, decrease the tax evasion, and the other problems. And I think this data-driven approach now could be included in TADAT performance assessment criteria. I don't know how, but should be included. Because we miss one tool to
access the digital maturity of tax administration. Now we are doing this because now we are trying to find a way to access now the digital maturity. And also, I would like to mention, like just 1 minute more, about mobile tax application, these apps that tax administration are developing in the region. Online portals, more like friendly now to communicate, for the taxpayer to communicate with tax administration, how to reach also the taxpayer. And pandemic has accelerated. We know now that it has accelerated technological development in the region, making online taxpayer assistance more common in Latin America. And it has led now to this shift now in the region, developing new technologies and the practices in response to the pandemic challenges. And I also mention what you said before. These improvements should be reflected in TADAT framework, especially when we are evaluating efficiency and the effectiveness of taxpayer communication, service delivery, and others. That's it.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you very much.
Just a heads up for the second round of questions. I'm going to reduce 2 minutes per speakers,
okay.
Because if not, we are not going to finish this. Okay? So you have thought about your question. 2 minutes to deliver. Marina, let's go to some kind of relationship here in the question to Monica and you, because Brazil has been particularly engaging in kind of technology innovation. And in general, in Latin America, as Monica was mentioned, this is an area of quite significant progress, but I know well the experience of Brazil, where the digitalization has been a priority and you have been investing a lot. So how the Brazilian experience in digitalization could or should be translated into the TADAT framework?
So thank you, Juan, for the question. And it's a big pleasure to be here celebrating TADAT. Thank you, Monica, for providing a strong foundation in our topic. So the Brazilian experience in digitalization was identified as one of our strengths in the TADAT assessment in 2020. And despite our complex legal framework and structural challenges, we have made significant advancements using technology. So, for example, I would like to mention 4 areas of technology use in Brazil that I believe strongly are related with the TADAT framework. First, the use of blockchain technology to exchange information in taxpayer registration process. Second, the use of chatbots and AI to guide taxpayers first in the customs services, but now this year to guide taxpayers in their income tax declarations. Third, the extensive Brazilian experience with the e-filing process, and particularly with the implementation of the public digital bookkeeping system and the electronic invoice. And finally, as our data volume expands, the use of technologies like data analytics, AI, and machine learning to improve processes like compliance risk management, audits, and dispute resolutions. Related to these examples, I would like to highlight some key points that I believe could contribute to TADAT. First, it could be interesting to emphasize the importance of interoperability standards and information exchange among government agents. Second, it seems prudent to include practices or indicators related to data security, data literacy, and data governance policies. Third, TADAT could also verify the capacity of tax administrations to stimulate real-time or close to real-time data collection or verification, and it would also be useful to evaluate how taxpayer services are integrated with the natural life cycle of people. And finally, it seems relevant to understand tax administration ability to become a truly data-driven organization, which means not only collecting data, but also using it to improve decision-making process and outcomes. To conclude, it's essential to remember that change is inevitable and that people must be in the center of this transformation. So the future should be inclusive and the future should be sustainable. So using technology and probably cooperation and using technology as a pathway to build a better society.
Thank you very much, Marina. So data-driven, but also people-driven.
Yes.
Good. Josué, Tuan just talked about expanding TADAT footprint globally, but in general, in Asia region has not have a kind of significant take-up TADAT. So what is your diagnostic and how we could kind of progress in the region, most populated nation in the world, but also combining with some very small countries, the Pacific. The changes that Paul mentioned during his presentation would help bring traction in the region. What is your views on this?
Thank you for the question. It's true. Historically, Asia lagged in the adoption of the TADAT during its first 5 to 6 years. However, over the past 4 years, we've seen a significant increase in its usage, especially since ADB has actively supported the dissemination of TADAT with support from the Domestic Resource Mobilization Trust Fund. In the Pacific region, out of 14 ADB member countries, only 3 have undergone TADAT assessments. This indicates a significant opportunity to expand TADAT initiatives in those economies. Based on our experience supporting tax administration reform in the Asia-Pacific region, we see their priorities such as digital transformation, international taxation, and compliance risk management aligned with global trends. The changes to the TADAT framework that Paul outlined should indeed help enhance these areas and increase engagement across the region. However, we've learned that TADAT assessments can be resource intensive, particularly for smaller Pacific economies with limited tax officials. Managing a 2 to 3 weeks assessment alongside regular operation is challenging. The geographic isolation of the Pacific also makes the development partners to visit frequently to the region. So it might be contribute to the slower TADAT adoption. To address these challenges, it would be beneficial for the revised field guide to explore more flexible assessment module and processes. For example, developing a simplified assessment framework could provide an entry point for smaller economies, allowing them to gradually embark on comprehensive assessments. Moreover, virtual assessments offer a potential solution due to their time and cost efficiency. ADB experienced the virtual assessment of Pakistan in 2021, and it was effective, although having at least one or a few team members on site is crucial for effective communication with government officials. Extending the assessment period through virtual means could also help alleviate resource constraints for smaller economies assessments. Thank you.
Thank you, Josué. The reference you make regarding the participation of a kind of member of the revenue, the tax administration, somehow is it's incorporated in the so-called assisted self-assessment, where sometimes part of the team of TADAT assessor is the administration that is assessed. But it's kind of something that has been performed, and it was performed particularly during the pandemic. And it's an interesting trend to continue improving. So now we are going to the second round of questions, and remember, 2 minutes. And I'm going to have here my timer. So, because we need to leave a little bit of time for discussion, okay? So, Deborah, Paul presented what are the considerations for the future TADAT. Kozue made some reference how she would like to see this in Asia. So what should the TADAT look like in the near future to better serve CD delivery? And remember, TADAT is a framework that we developed to better assist countries in reform agenda. So how this will help us in CD delivery? Deborah, 2 minutes.
Well, that was a very big question, so I'm boiling it down to 3 points, which may or may not answer your question. So my first point is about quality. TADAT is a quality product delivered in a very high quality manner, and we cannot let that slip. And so part of that is the quality of the assessors. And I was a bit amazed to know there's 626 assessors, because I couldn't count them on the website. There were too many. So I think a risk area, I'm thinking about risk rather than what the actual tool looks like, is how do we maintain the quality pool of assessors as it gets ever bigger and bigger and bigger. Mary, I know, mentioned this earlier as well. So I believe evaluations are done of the assessors, but you know, I'm a trained assessor. I did one TADAT 10 years ago, something like that. So would you send me on a, oh, no one's going to say, oh, it's being recorded. Oh my God. Anyway, would you send me on a TADAT tomorrow? That's a good question I can't answer. So second point I'd like to raise, which actually Kozue just touched on as well, and in a related way, and that's the use of TADAT in fragile and conflict-affected states. And I sort of like the idea of a simplified tool that maybe can be used in those environments. It can be overwhelming for them. They can fear that everything will be a D, so what's the point? Does it even help? So I think you know, how do we use this fantastic tool in these different environments? We use it in all sorts of environments, but for fragile states, all these very small economies, how can it be useful, and how do we manage using it in that environment? And my third point is actually about future expansion. So TADAT for customs, maybe not our space, but you know, I know the WCO takes the lead in standard setting around the world on customs, but is there a TADAT for customs? And the other one, which our colleague from Zambia really made me think about, was when there's an integrated revenue administration, like many of the revenue authorities in sub-Saharan Africa, you know, you're sort of assessing this bit of the operations, but they're so interrelated with the customs part. You know, can TADAT cope with that? Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Tuan, Paul mentioned that GovTech digitalization is under consideration with the several kind of specific issues. Which of these topics do you consider key to keep the tool relevant for tax administration? 2 minutes, please.
10-second, short answer is that I agree with everything that Paul already said. So all dimensions need to be considered in the new revamped TADAT. Now, let me talk a little bit about, more about this. First, about climate change. It is really the everyday, talk everywhere. And tax policy and tax administration have a role to play in that. In the impending, like it or not, but in the impending EU CBAM, right? The revenue administrations need to think about like what kind of strategy and how they can monitor and administer the evolving explicit, implicit carbon pricing regimes. And the other part in the area of digitalization, Monica already mentioned quite a bit about like the trending in Latin America, and that is also reaffirming the SNAP survey that the bank also conducted in the context of Asia, the administrations really think about like the digitalization creates like both challenges and also opportunities for them to think about, and they need to change. They need to prioritize at different maturity level of revenue administrations. So those are the things that need to be factored in. And the last point I would like to mention in here is that the TADAT, the current film guide, is quite comprehensive. I must say, look at that. It's a very comprehensive, and it already covers certain aspects of digitalization and also ICT in certain aspects, certain tax administration functions. And the question now is how we can make it more relevant, particularly now 10 years already passed. Digitalization, advanced technologies, and so on. That already put like the new, adding some sort of dimensions in like the setting of revenue administration. So how we can adapt the TADAT to measure, to assess those trending accordingly.
Thank you, Tuan. This is very interesting. So Monica, something we have heard sometimes is some tax authorities complain that TADAT actually doesn't assess their performance. And probably this is coming from the perspective that they are thinking in their organization, not in the tax administration system, which is an issue, of course. What are the areas of the tool that should be improved to better reflect the performance of tax administrations?
Yeah, it happens sometimes. Because tax administrators, normally they think only about tax administration, not the system. But especially there are two areas that, like I know that they complain a lot. It's tax dispute resolution, because sometimes there are other institutions that or tribunal now that make part of this POA. But even if you are assessing, for example, the timeline, for resolve or solve the case in tax administration, but it's the whole system. And sometimes what you can see is the legislation, it's in place, and everything is in place, but didn't work because the results or the outcomes are not good for tax administration. Then we need to explain it during the assessment and also during the final next meeting. And the other area they used to complain is debt recovery, or tax debt recovery, because also enforce the debt enforcement recovery. Now, in some tax administration, outside tax administration, they depend on the other institution to do this. And also, the outcome, it's not good for tax administration, especially because they don't have data. In tax administration, they don't have data what the other institution or organization is doing. And then, like, the outcomes are not good for these two areas. I think I would like to highlight, but there are others, and but that's it. It's time to rethink TADAT 2 for the future and incorporate like some nuances of tax administration or the tax system.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point of controversy somehow, because
I know.
Because what apparently is happening is that we have not been, let's say, disseminating well that TADAT is about the tax administration system. So not only the tax authorities should be worried about this, it's more the overall government that there is different parts that are not directly responsibility of the tax administration. You mentioned the appeal system that typically goes beyond the tax authority. So this is something that maybe is for the Secretary to reflect, how we disseminate better what the framework is about. It's not about the tax department, sometimes very fragmented. It's about the tax administration system. Marina, from one of the kind of priority topic that has been also raised, Tuan mentioned digitalization, climate, but also another topic that has been more prominent is gender. From the Brazilian standpoint, can gender be considered a specific segment group of taxpayer toward which the tax administration must deploy specific services to be effective from a TADAT perspective? What is the Brazilian view on this?
To talk about gender in a panel with woman representation.
Good.
And I truly believe that women should be considered as a segment of taxpayers, and tax administrations play an important role in ensuring that gender-sensitive tax policies are designed to reduce barriers for women. So particularly women entrepreneurs often face unique challenges such as limited access to resources, and by recognizing these challenges, tax administrations can create targeted services to reduce gender disparities and help women meet their tax obligations. Some actions could be considered to promote gender policies, and like collecting and analyzing data disaggregated by gender, promoting financial literacy, considering ways to bring women into the formal sector, and promoting women within our organization. So from the Brazilian standpoint, gender issues are on our agenda, but initially our focus is more on integrating gender equality to ensure equal opportunities for all employees. Moving from a gender-responsive human resources policies to promoting gender-sensitive tax policies is our necessary next step. And the topic also needs to be integrated within a broader context of ESG policies. In conclusion, I firmly believe that representation matters in all scenarios. For example, even in the TADAT evaluation process, we should pay attention to gender-related topics. Considering that TADAT assessment involve key decision makers in tax administration, what would the gender balance look like if we took a picture during a TADAT evaluation? Taking Brazil as an example, a picture from 2024 would be significantly different from one taken in 2020, the moment of our assessment. Today, we would see a more gender-balanced representation, but we know there is still much more work to be done.
Thank you, Marina. I'm glad that you highlighted that the panel is so gender balance. Kozue, IDB through the Asian Pacific Tax Hub has been promoting a lot the knowledge sharing and DRM, collecting information in the region. How do you see the ever-growing volume of TADAT data helping countries and partners like the IMF, IDB to analyze and improve tax administration performance?
Thank you very much for discussing the Asia Pacific Tax Hub, or APTH. Established in 2021 under the strong leadership of the ADB President, Mr. Asakawa, APTH serves as an open and inclusive platform for strategic policy dialogue, knowledge sharing, and capacity development on domestic resource mobilization and international tax cooperation. As part of APTH activities, we published the comparative analysis of tax administration in Asia and the Pacific. The 7th edition of this series reports data and comments on administrative features and performance up to ISRA 2022 for 41 economies across the region. The analysis primarily relies on the ISRA data, supplemented by findings from TADAT assessments. A preliminary observation from TADAT assessments in the region identified 4 areas frequently receiving the lowest rating. First, efficient revenue management. Second, accurate reporting on declarations. Third, timely filing of declarations. And fourth, effective risk management. The insights from the ISORA and the TADAT findings have been invaluable in shaping our capacity building and the knowledge sharing programs, as well as our technical assistance initiatives. These analyses help us identify recurring issues and the challenges in regional tax administration, thereby enhancing the focus on the effectiveness of our programs. Moreover, the outcomes of the TADAT assessment directly benefit our core activities, such as the design and the implementation of the lending programs. The weaknesses highlighted by the TADAT assessment were utilized to develop policy actions to be implemented by the governments for loan disbursement. Given these benefits, ADB wholeheartedly supports the use of TADAT assessment and aims to participate in all assessments for our developing members. We are also pleased to collaborate with the TADAT Secretariat to organize events for disseminating updates to the field guide once finalized. Thank you.
Thank you, Kosue. I'm very glad to hear that our development partners are using TADAT framework to guide their reform kind of projects. We heard in the previous panel how EC really is using this framework, and I'm sure other partners. Something that I guess we need to work more is how to align the first TADAT assessment with the repeated assessment, something we discussed before, because the TADAT assessment is a diagnostic, a picture in one moment of time, but if we take picture in different moment of time, it's also kind of an assessment framework for kind of measuring if we do progress when we are undertaking reforms that are supported by partners, are supported by TA provider like us, etc. So because just taking one TADAT in isolation is just a picture in one specific point in time. But what we need to have is something that really is an evolving process. But reform by definition, institutional reform is an evolving process. So we have some minutes, 10 minutes for question and answers. So Catherine, please feel free to raise your physical hands.
Thank you so much. Is this working?
No. Maybe the other one behind you. Oh, now it's working. Now it's working.
Okay. So wonderful panel, really interesting observations. So I have a couple of questions and just reflection. So for Kosue, we were talking about the Asia Pacific Tax Hub, the role of the ADB, and our wish to have better coverage of TADAT in the Asia Pacific region, which is quite diverse. We also heard today from our EC colleagues that there's an approach they're using of having several countries undertake the TADATs kind of together as a group, right? Be trained, undertake them, talk about the standards and their practices, and it's a kind of a very interesting new way of working on TADAT. So my question to you is, do you think that the Asia Pacific Tax Hub could potentially play a similar role in promoting TADATs for multi-country TADATs in these small countries? So that's one question. And the other one is a reflection on TADAT, a simplified framework for TADAT for fragile and conflict-affected states, that perhaps without changing the TADAT framework itself, because as Andrea pointed out, it's really important to maintain that integrity, right, the end-to-end view. Perhaps one option would be to identify those aspects that are truly of a fundamental nature in all of this TADAT chain, rather than design something more simplified, but identify what's really fundamental and what's perhaps fancier, or for a tax administration that it's a separate level, a little bit more advanced level of development. And that way you keep the structure, but you identify the fundamentals, and then you apply that sort of fundamental framework to countries that have, that still have a way to go to strengthen their institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Any other question? I don't see any hands. Please.
Good afternoon. Supriyo from Revenue Administration 1. I had this part about the socioeconomic aspect is interesting, and I had a sort of a half question, half comment about it, is while gender is being taken into cognizance, what about age distinctions? Because especially when technology comes in, for the older generation, very often there is a techno-anxiety in dealing with it, and especially suppose you have pre-filled returns and one morning a person has this moment, you get up and you see that your return is pre-filled and it's not right, and there's something to be done. So if age is taken into account, my suggestion, it would be a good thing, because I remember anecdotally that when Singapore was computerizing their tax administration, they had special classes for the seniors to learn computers. That's my thought.
Thank you very much. Any other question? Okay, with the power that give me to be moderator, I'm going to ask first Kozue to address the question that Catherine raised, very concrete, how the experience of EC in doing this regional approach in countries could be applied to each. Deborah, I'm going to ask you for the second question, which is related to a simplified framework for TADAT. And Monica, and also Marina could contribute. You talk about digitalization and technology, and Supriya was mentioned that, well, all people maybe struggle with this. So, okay, in that order, Kozue.
Oh, thank you. Actually, the multi-country approach is what I was very interested in when I saw the report, TADAT 10 years report. So I'd like to learn more about because in the Pacific region, as I said earlier, the virtual assessment or same level of the countries, there's a lot of countries. So I think the multi-country approach would be applicable to the Pacific regions. Thank you.
Yeah. I know a little bit about the experience of EC because we work with them in the context of the European Commission Southeast Europe program. And what is interesting in that experience is that they try somehow to use TADAT framework for EU member states in order to have an approach where they could assess all EU member states with a standard framework. DG Reform from European Commission provide funding to EU countries. And the idea is to align the project related to tax administration with a framework that is standard. So somehow they are trying to standardize the approach of tax administration across European Union member. So it's very interesting in that regard because it's indeed a regional approach. Deborah.
Thank you. I think is my mic? Yes, it is. On the fragile states, I'm sort of quite excited about Catherine's idea there that we strip out some core fundamentals from this and ignore the fancy stuff that the advice. So TADAT is going to become even more sophisticated in Field Guide 2025. It's going to be more cutting edge, about using artificial intelligence or using all digitized responses. There's no more letters. There's no more phone calls. But in the less sophisticated, less mature administrations, these things are still really important. So I would hate to see some of those disappear. So maybe there is a sort of a core list of fundamentals that, the basics, as I call them, that every administration should have. And there's only so much leapfrogging that can go on. And we've really learned this, I think, in our history of working with tax administrations, that yes, you can leapfrog, but often you can't leapfrog. You really have to get the basics in place before you can launch yourself further. So I think there's some good thinking we could do in that space. And just on the regional project, I was just last week at the IOTA conference where Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece were there. So they shared some of their experiences of doing this, in threesome, in like a tandem with the three countries, all coming together to get the training, coming back together after the event, discussing their own experiences. I think it's quite hard for them to reveal their weaknesses, but I think in terms of sharing strengths, it's been quite successful. So depending on the countries you have and how comfortable they feel with each other, to really share the full experience of the TADAT is part of the equation of who you put together, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Just one reflection, and I want to go back again to what we have been discussing, and I am being stressing that, again, the focus is on outcomes. It's not in the good practice. The good practice could produce good outcome, but if we start measuring how much artificial intelligence a tax administration could have, that would be the wrong approach. But because the tax administration has to deliver outcomes. With artificial intelligence, maybe it's better, but if we are going to assess a fragile state on the filing and payment, what we want is they have a high rate of filing and payment. This is what we want. It's not that if they use artificial intelligence or not for doing that. It's do they have a high filing and payment? So in this regard, going to basic is very key, not just be kind of blind by the use of technology or the like. So I would like to stress this. Monica, on the all people and the challenges of digitalization.
People and challenges.
All people like us, by the way.
Yeah, like us, struggling with this artificial intelligence and the other things. But I think that's important to consult the taxpayer. When they are tax administration are developing new tools or pre-filled declaration or other things, talk to the taxpayer and ask them for improvements, because the objective is, in my opinion, talking about our experience, is improve the experience and decrease or reduce the taxpayer compliance cost, not increasing this stress to deal with tax administration. There are some I would like to stress, in the Marina can complete this. There are some tax administration that are still working remotely. Most of the tax officials are working remotely, and it's a mess for taxpayers to contact tax administration, or by phone or by I don't know. For some, it's very difficult to have a in-person meeting, and we should reflect about it. Now, how digitalization is improving the experience for taxpayers, because of course it's good for tax administration in some point, but also for taxpayers, how they are accepting and incorporate it in their daily activities.
Okay. So Marina, would you like to intervene? Monica said,
about this taxpayer experience.
Monica said that she was speaking from her opinion, I guess, not from IDB.
No, not from IDB. My opinion, my experience.
So I believe the future is hybrid. So we need in tax administrations use different strategies to design our services and how we interact with the taxpayers. So we need to understand communication is common for everyone, and we need to understand how taxpayers prefer to communicate and speak the same language of them.
So clearly, tax administration cannot escape the need to provide targeted service to different group of taxpayers, and they had to be customized. So Tuan, any final work on your side?
I'm not so sure, it is a really final word, but I would like to come back to the really tough question about how we can really reconcile between the need for rigorous assessment for advanced, more measured revenue administration, and for those that are really in the fragile, conflicted, affected states. Now, I think that I really fully, in line with what Andrea mentioned, that we need to have some sort of the integrity and the uniformity in the assessment across. And the TADAT, that is really designed to measure outcomes. So in each of the POA, we have the measurement, dimensions. We have the indicators. So even we come to really, the administration with very, early stage and really poor administration. we still have some sort of the description of the outcomes from each of the POA. And here I would like to relate to really the other point that really raised from the from the last year midterm review. The point is that maybe here we want to make sure that we link the TADAT findings with the complementary TAs, capacity building, and or maybe a landing operations here. But we need to bridge that. So the midterm review also mentioned that maybe we can have some sort of the post-PAR, the post-performance assessment report after the TADAT. So that can be used, that can be developed and prepared in discussion with revenue administrations post-TADAT to identify the key weaknesses in the context of the country, in the context of the specific administration, and see what kind of the actions, what kind of the reforms, what kind of sequencing might be appropriate for the country. So that's really some sort of reconciling between the rigorous and some sort of the suitable practical assessment.
Thank you very much, Tuan. Being 5:30, we are just in time finishing our panel. I ask a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. I extend my heartfelt thanks to Juan, our distinguished panelists, as they leave the stage, and of course, our devoted audience for your fervent dedication to nurturing a meaningful conversation about the future of TADAT. I need to say that your enthusiasm and insightful contribution have truly enriched today's dialogue and set a forward-looking tone for the evolution of TADAT. As we approach the conclusion of our event, it's with great honor that I invite to the stage Victor Gaspar, the esteemed director of the Fiscal Affairs Department, for the closing remarks. Please, Victor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thanks for your kind introduction. I witnessed the most of the panel, not all of the panel, most of the panel. Unfortunately, I was not able to be with you for the full celebration of the 10th anniversary of TADAT. Given the content of the discussion, if you allow me 60 seconds more, I will share with you my favorite joke from 2019. That had to do with that joke is in a book by Michael Lewis, The Undoing Project, and there he describes an interview with Daniel Kahneman's co-author, Amos Tversky. And Amos was working on behavioral economics with his co-author, and he was asked, "What about artificial intelligence, Professor Tversky? What do you have to tell us about artificial intelligence?" And Amos said something like, "I have not worked on artificial intelligence. Some of my colleagues here at Stanford have done so. As for me, most of my research is devoted to natural stupidity." And that basically is something which is actually not completely relevant for TADAT, because taxpayers and tax administrators are humans, and therefore issues of behavioral economics are crucial in this area, and technology alone will not solve anything. But technology together with what Juan has called the basics may well be extremely important. Today, we are celebrating a decade of TADAT achievements. From the IMF's perspective, TADAT has exceeded our expectations. Let me point a few ways in which it has done so. First, as was clear, I'm sure, during the afternoon, but certainly during the panel, TADAT has become an accepted, standardized framework for assessing tax administration effectiveness worldwide. In this regard, TADAT operates like a global public good, a very valuable global public good. Second, many countries now use TADAT results as the starting point for designing and implementing core institutional and procedural reforms to strengthen their tax administration. In several countries, TADAT has informed the design of medium-term revenue strategies. At the IMF, TADAT is well integrated in the process of designing and delivering capacity development programs to member countries. That said, it remains first and foremost an assessment tool, and in my view, it should remain as such and not evolve into something else. TADAT should remain TADAT. Third, and I believe very clearly represented in your work today, TADAT is a reflection of global cooperation, and that is a very valuable asset in an increasingly polarized world. During the conference, many have highlighted the crucial role of collaboration for TADAT to be TADAT. Let me briefly look to the future. As research in FAD has shown, tax capacity determines state capacity. It is also linked to the level and pace of countries' economic growth. Our research has also shown that for low-income developing countries, while the tax to GDP ratio has increased 3.5 points of GDP in 30 years, from 1990 to 2020, the average tax to GDP ratio is still low and well below 15% of GDP that we have identified as a tipping point. It's also well below what countries need to finance development. TADAT must remain as robust and relevant in the next 10 years as it has been in the first decade, and continue to provide a solid basis on which countries can rely to modernize their tax administration systems and meet the enormous financing challenges ahead. I want to thank speakers, panelists, and participants. Your questions, discussions, and experience have enriched this afternoon sessions. Special thanks is due to Modeste, MOPA, and the TADAT Secretariat for your tireless efforts to produce an excellent 10-year report and for organizing this event. And last, but certainly not least, I want to thank our partners for supporting TADAT. Please continue doing so. Thank you all.
Thank you, Vitor. I'd like to take a moment to express our profound gratitude to our director for delivering the closing remarks. Your words have eloquently captured the essence of our collective efforts and aspirations. And thank you all once again for being part of this memorable occasion. Your presence and contribution have made this event not just a gathering, but a vibrant exchange of ideas. As we bring our formal proceedings to a close, the conversation doesn't have to end here. We will invite you to join us for some drinks and food on the Red Level Gallery. This will be a wonderful opportunity to continue our discussions, network, and enjoy each other's company in a more relaxed setting. We look forward to seeing you there and keeping the conversation flowing. Thank you.